Welcome to GONKCAST, a long-form discussion podcast about the music of English electronic duo Autechre, album by album, EP by EP. I'm Gabe.
I'm Dan.
And this is yet another installment of our AE Revisited series, this time on Autechre's 2008 LP, Quaristice. Before we jump in, don't forget that we've launched a Patreon. For just $5 a month, you'll get bi-weekly bonus episodes on AE-adjacent music, plus the opportunity to vote on future bonus episode topics. Last week, for example, the patrons decided we should do an episode on Boards of Canada's 2013 LP, Tomorrow's Harvest. It was fun, wasn't it, Dan?
Yeah, that was a good one.
You know, it's interesting. At this point, I've learned this about our listeners, that they're really crazy about 2013. I mean, it was kind of like a boom year for electronic music, and a particular kind of, dark, gritty, XI-esque kind of music. And I don't know, I never really intended this to be the case with these bonus episodes, but I feel like we are often kind of filling in like context around this stuff. Sometimes it's like, exact context like this, another 2013 album by a IDM titan, but sometimes it's like more distant, like when we talk about Kraftwerk or something. But I'm sorry, I thought it would be like fun offshoots, but I'm starting to feel like these bonus episodes, this is me plugging it for the freeloaders out there. I'm starting to feel like they're like essential to our ongoing conversations about Autechre in a way,
Yeah, you're really selling it.
Yeah, I'm not just saying that, I swear to God.
No, I agree. I agree.
Well, head on over, if that sounds interesting to you, to patreon.com/GONKCAST and join us. Shout out, by the way, to our newest patrons, Andrew, Jonathan, and Jackson. For our next bonus episode coming next week, the patrons have chosen Flying Lotus's 2008 LP, Los Angeles. I thought it would be fun in the spirit of these like 2013 albums we had been doing to make a list of like 2008 albums now that we're talking about the whole Quaristice era and kind of think about some of the context there. Actually, to be perfectly honest, Portishead and Flying Lotus ended in a tie, but I hadn't voted yet. So I decided to vote for Flying Lotus. I was the tiebreaker. Is that fair?
I just maybe don't tell people. We got a little bit of voter fraud, going on.
Yeah. It's like, it's fishy, but I feel like I get a vote like anybody else. Why not? The president
Yeah,
gets
that's true.
vote.
I mean, I voted, yeah, so.
Oh, well, you shouldn't say that because that means we get 2 votes technically.
Oh, I guess you're right. Yeah, that's a little sketchy. Erase that.
Yeah, look out for that on that episode on Los Angeles by Flying Lotus, and send us your thoughts, goncastpod@gmail.com. For our next main episode, which will be free for everybody as always, we're going to finish the Quaristice era, as I was just saying, by revisiting Autechre's newly streaming, by the way, Quaristice Versions bonus disc and the Quaristice Quadrange EP. Plus, I guess, the digital exclusives EP. Why not? Revisit all that stuff for yourself and tell us what you think. Again, that's goncastpod@gmail.com. Always like to start with some corrections, leftovers, news if we have some. We actually do have a little this time. On March 20th, so that was just a couple days ago, Rob Brown played a 4-ish hour DJ set at Public Records in Brooklyn, New York. And user Coria on Reddit shared these reflections. As the night went on, he started dropping little snippets of Autechre, mostly from earlier Incunabula Amber crowd pleasers. The first and probably coolest iteration was when he had a pretty straight-ahead bass-heavy house track playing and then began looping the scratchy loop from Bass Cadet over it. Something about this combo unlocked the dance floor in such a beautiful way, even the frat bros were wigging out. Later on, he dropped Piezo and Glitch being the more dance floor deepening of the two, and then fast forwarding to a bit later, he threw in the shimmerings from Carefree Counter Dronal and then layered it with the onslaught of North Spiral. That was fun, but not quite as successful as Bass Cadet or Glitch. Last song I caught, though I'm feeling already like I'm forgetting some cool ones, was LCC, the claps of which he layered atop a really killer dubsteppy bass. Really interesting, right?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I had seen like the ad and stuff, floating around. That'd be a pretty cool thing to go to. I saw too that the rest of what that person wrote on Reddit, they said it's like a pretty normie kind of bar, and it wasn't packed or anything. It's kind of funny.
It's fun. Yeah, I just would never picture him kind of going down memory lane like that. Maybe people can tell me like if you've seen other DJ sets by him or both of them. I just, I've listened to like their live stream DJ sets sometimes, that's the extent of my knowledge. And they're always doing like the deepest cut, like 80s hip hop and stuff. And I'm just surprised by this. I also saw somebody noting that in Brooklyn that same night, funny enough, it would be possible to have seen Shane Parrish, who was playing Autechre guitar and then go to another Brooklyn venue to see this show. So one could have seen the acoustic version and then the electronic version, so to speak.
Wow, the Big Apple.
Yeah, ain't it true? A couple more leftover things. Actually, this was listener CP writing in about our episode on Shane Parrish's Autechre guitar, our interview with Shane. CP said, I couldn't order this release fast enough and it doesn't disappoint. Loved it so much I grabbed a test pressing too. Shane has pulled so many nuances and melodies out of the original AE material that many are either new discoveries for me or long since forgotten from this decades old material. Thanks for this interview, and thanks Shane for an incredible recording and pressing. Favorite at the moment is 9. I thought that was a nice comment. And then I also want to read this from Sock Mace, who said, I have binged this podcast over the past month or two and can now finally write in. Firstly, I would like to say that both of your top 10 lists are terrible. How dare you? Secondly, love the podcast. I honestly have just no memory. Like, we used to do this on the original run of the podcast. We would keep this running top 10 list that we would update as we went. I have no memory of what my top 10 list was.
I don't even remember that we did that.
Really?
I really don't know.
I thought we wrapped up every conversation.
Yeah, no, I have no idea what the list was.
Well, I feel like we're going to have to do, some episode or something real clickbait shit, but we'll do an episode eventually where it's our current top 10 list or something. I actually got this idea where me and Dan were talking about it. It was kind of inspired by something a listener had written in, but I think within the next couple of weeks, we want to do, something for fun, just to take some steam off or whatever, a top 10 Autechre closing tracks episode or something like that. Maybe down the road, top 10 opening tracks or something. I feel like we might have fun with that. But Dan, we got a whole lot of tracks to talk about today. You ready to dive into Quaristice?
Yeah, let's do it. Some background, Quaristice was Autechre's 9th studio album, released on January 29th, 2008. The circumstances behind the LP are well known at this point, but the short version of it is this. Sean moved into a new place after the Untilted tour, and while his studio gear was in storage, he and Rob started improvising with their live rig and ended up recording 2-hour jams a day for months. Thus began a long editing process of, in Sean's word, making a long version, then doing an edit, then editing that, then doing it again, seeing how far we could push them into being smaller things, more as an exercise than anything. In my head, I was trying to be Art of Noise in 1984, seeing how many ways you can flip a thing into different contexts by editing. Many of these different versions would be released against the main Quaristice album, the limited edition Quaristice Versions bonus disc, released with the physical version of Quaristice on March 3rd, 2008, the Japanese exclusive digital exclusives EP, which was released on April 23rd, and the massive Quaristice Quad Range EP .ae, which was released on May 19th. Today's episode is just about the main record, and we're going to talk about the other stuff on our next main Autechre episode.
So, of course, the reason we knew we had to get to Quaristice on this revisited series is because in their very recent interview, as we discussed with lking.net on the occasion of their February 2026 shows in Japan, Sean and Rob explicitly identified it as, quote, the starting point that led us to where we are today. Sean explained, at that point, we realized that what we were doing live was at least as polished as the works we had released on record. So with Quaristice, we wanted to intentionally blur that boundary. Even now, we continue to explore the blurred boundaries between what is live, what is in real time, and what is spontaneous improvisation. We are very interested in these strange, quote, nowhere to be a spaces. This is getting translated from Japanese back to English, so I think something went wonky there. Created by modern technology, he continues, where composition and improvisation can coexist. Now with the widespread use of DAWs, extremely intentional production methods have become the norm. That's why I've become more strongly drawn to roughness, improvisation, and raw, unprocessed quality. I'm very interested in the feeling of things happening as they are. Computers inevitably lead people to intentional thinking.
Sean continues, that's also why we create our own software. It's not that I don't use DAWs at all, but what I'm really interested in is capturing moments. Moments are very precious. I don't know if that's because of my age or not. When I listen back to my old work, I can hear those one-off quirky moments of choice. It's like something that's almost impossible to reproduce by happenstance, and I was able to record it. I think that's really valuable. Quaristice is a work where I intentionally selected such moments without being constrained by technical limitations. It may not have been as successful as our later albums, but I think it was definitely the first step in the right direction.
I also want to add to the record a few comments about Quaristice from Ask Autechre, any things that post-date our original episode on this album. In an especially illuminating comment, Sean said, Quaristice is meant to flow like a long dream. You know how doors lead to different chapters and worlds before you realize, oops, I'm revealing things now. Also, when asked, do you have your own Quaristice era playlist of tracks? A fair amount of us have our own versions of the albums. Rob replied, well, no, not really. We made it so you could do all that instead of us. So, Dan, I honestly couldn't really remember where you kind of stand on Quaristice. What were your feelings about this record prior to our revisit this week?
Yeah, I don't remember what I said last time we talked about it. But I like this record. It's maybe not one that I pick up every time, mostly because of like the kind of mess of how many versions and everything, and I don't like to make playlists, so I haven't done that or anything, But I've always enjoyed it. I think it's great, and I'm pretty sure I said that last time. If I didn't, I was wrong. Yeah,
I mean, this is like a go-to for me. It's one of my favorites for sure. It was, a lot of listeners actually wrote in with similar stories about this, but it was the first Autechre record that came out after I had become a big fan. And I've mentioned before on the podcast that I had this sense that like the IDM era had passed or something. Like once I started to get into it, I was like, oh, that's over. It's too bad I missed that. And then when I saw like Autechre came out with a new album, I was like, whoa, they're still doing stuff. It's kind of stupid that I felt that way, but that's how I felt. And, it really got a poor reception at that time. And I always kind of liked it, but I was like, okay, well, I guess it is over. I missed the golden age, It wasn't really until our original run of the podcast that like it 100% clicked for me. And ever since then, it's been one of my favorites. I wanted to ask on that note, actually, like, what is your sense of the reputation of this record? Because my feeling is that, a lot of listeners wrote in kind of describing it as like having haters or being like the runt of the litter or something like that. My sense is that it has been growing in estimation with the hardcore fans like quite intensely, but among like casuals, it's still looked down on as kind of a miss. And so it has this weird, like, I bet if you could do a rate your music of only Autechre obsessives, it would be extremely highly ranked, among their discography, but as is, it's generally kind of appears near the bottom. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It's right now at a 3.44 on Rate Your Music. Yeah, I think like you're right. It really is sort of a fan kind of record. I think because like now, looking back, it's sort of like the beginning. I think we talked a lot about like XI being, like the start of, Autechre 2.0, but really Quaristice is sort of like, the pre of that, and so I think it's definitely like a more fan record, but I get why like, a casual maybe doesn't like it, like that Dream thing that Rob said, it's sort of like jumps all over the place and maybe on the surface doesn't feel so cohesive, which I think can be difficult if it's not something you are like already into.
Yeah, I'm putting money on the fact that this record is going to continue to climb in estimation, and that the casuals will catch up eventually, and it'll be seen as like one of their top. That's my hunch.
There's the rating trend on Rate Your Music. It has been trending up, so
yeah,
yeah.
I feel like every record has been trending up. Actually, I was looking back at
it's just more users.
Yeah, we used to discuss actually like where are all these records rated at the time, and they were all lower than they are now. Actually, I do believe that this was on our first run of the podcast. It was the lowest rated of their studio LPs. It's now really only above like Sign and Plus, which are also going to, I think, take their time to find their audience. But how do you feel about this record now, having, dwelt on it for a whole week or so?
Yeah, I mean, like I felt almost every one of these episodes, it's been really nice, like spending time with just this record, especially because last time we did it, and we did it with like all the bonus, quad range and everything, surrounding it. So I really did just like only listen to the main one. I did put on Perlint's sub-range earlier today, but for the most part, I only listened to the regular one, kind of pretended that was all that existed,
right.
Tried to look at it in a vacuum, and it was really great. I mean, it doesn't get boring, even though it's been 2 weeks, because of there is such a like, vast difference between all the tracks, and you get all these sort of different worlds and stuff. It really like held up to listening to it way too many times.
Yeah, I love this record. It's one of my favorites, like I said. I think it's like top tier Autechre, or at least almost top tier Autechre. I mean, the thing that I think is really fun about it is that it has this kind of like inspired quality, or this almost reinvigorated quality. Of course, it's coming off of some of Autechre's most meticulously sequenced music, and it just sounds like it sounds like they're a little bit like gloves off or something, like just letting it rip, and you kind of feel that. I think even if you don't know the context of like the records before, I think you put this on and it sounds spontaneous. It sounds, energetic, reinvigorated, right? I think anybody would get that. That being said, I do think, well, actually, I kind of changed my mind on this a little bit this week, but I've always felt that it's a bit over edited. Like it's been cut down too much. It's interesting to actually be talking about this shortly after we talked about XI, which was made in a similar way, but doesn't feel over edited. As we discussed, like you almost would never know that most of those XI tracks came from longer jams, because they feel so like perfectly formed. They have like a clear start. There's usually kind of an outro piece. It just feels like it makes sense. Whereas this, you always have the sense that like the thing was going before you got to listen, and it was, continued to go afterwards. And that's even without listening to any of the other versions or anything. You feel that. However, I kind of changed my mind this week in realizing that it's not actually over edited as much as I think it's like under jammed. You know what I mean? It's not like there's more of your favorite parts that they spent longer on or anything. They are literally just like moving from idea to idea so fast. And it's interesting that over their next records, they seem to be kind of like challenging themselves to stay in it a bit longer, to like dwell in the moment and see what kind of rewards that reaps. I think XI is quite a like happy medium there. LSEC, I would say arguably they're like spending too much time, or like not editing enough. And yet, by the time you get to NTS sessions, they are happily spending 20 minutes on a single idea, and it's totally working, So like they spend the next couple of records trying to figure out like how to stay in it productively. But the weakness of this record is that they move on too fast. You know what I mean? They aren't jamming masters just yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's like sort of the proto record of like new Autechre, because they totally haven't got that like fully formed yet. And even I think it was the XI episode we read where they said, like it's edited down basically because people don't have 2 hours or whatever to listen to the record. And I think like over time they realize that like the people that are into this, will maybe make the time, and then even just being set free from, the technology or technological limitations, of the CD and all that sort of stuff, like having the free range to, spend whatever time they want, with LSEC, and then I think really like perfected on NTS, like that perfect meld of jamming, sticking with it. Some of it edited down, just like a real mix of all the best parts of that. But here, you do like there's a lot of hard cuts out the end of tracks and stuff. It feels like we're just pulling the plug, getting out of here. But I don't dislike that. I think it works. And as we get to the tracks, I even made some notes. I think there's sometimes on the record those like hard cuts sound like so cool because within the tracks, you know, they're so often like you said, like instead of jamming on one idea, they're kind of going through it. So sometimes those hard cuts, like you're in a new track and you almost don't realize it, which makes me think of like AE, you know, 2022 Dash and everything.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, it is interesting how in a way 2022 Dash is like specifically a return to this kind of approach. Like, it actually is really fast. You know, when you look on AE pages how they have divided the tracks up, you notice that almost every like piece, you know, track, quote unquote, is not more than like 5 minutes or so. You know, they actually are moving quite quickly. It's not like it's not at a Quaristice clip, but they have gone from NTS where they're spending 20 minutes on one thing to now moving much faster than that. It's like now they can go back to smaller scale with the mastery that they got, you know, with all this kind of like real jamming they've been doing, and they can like work on that smaller scale more successfully. I wanted to ask you the other like potential hang up I have with this record is the flow or maybe lack thereof. You know, a lot of people describe this as like a data dump. I think Sean's comment about like the different doors or something is really interesting. And yet there's like a lot of evidence of sequencing. Obviously it's not just on shuffle, you know, it starts with the perfect intro. It ends with a perfect outro. I think there's even like a flow of moods sort of, if you listen to it. And yet that flow is sometimes kind of baffling, right? Like, I think we hit like 5 bangers in a row, like 5 all-time bangers in a row. And then we entered this weird like electroacoustic section, and you're like, why are all these pieces, you know, right back to back? So it's a little odd. I mean, how do you think of this record? Do you think of it as like it does have a flow, or it's actually 100% just meant to be like mixed and matched on your own playlist, or what?
You know, that always sort of was like, I think my problem, you know, with the record too, is like it definitely like on the surface doesn't like it seems like, you know, data dump or whatever, but I don't know, there are like some, you know, very intentional seeming choices, like you said, the intro, I think the outro, the last 2 tracks like work together well. There's a whole like little section that's like 3 tracks that really like just kind of feel like a suite and stuff. I mean, it definitely, I don't know, I guess maybe it, like should you put the electroacoustic stuff back to back or not is maybe the main question. I personally don't really have a problem with it, but it is sort of I think I said it at the beginning of the episode, like I think that is why this record is sort of harder for the not as big of a fan. And even, you know, maybe in 2008 might have been harder too, because you didn't have the foresight of, you know, LSEC and NTS and stuff. But I feel like, you know, that is just sort of what they've moved into a bit, is like switching around and everything. So it's not as like strange now as a like informed listener, you know?
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know. I guess the more I listened to it this week, the more I sort of thought, all right, if you take that like dream comment seriously, then the record has this kind of like, you know, there's a point kind of starting from track 6 through track 9, that like real electroacoustic kind of almost dark ambient territory where, you know, you almost think like, okay, this is drifting into the deep like REM sleep or something, and then it perks back up and is quite playful and all different kinds of things. And then by the time we get to the end with like Not To and the last track Out 9X, we're then submerging back into that like depth. So it almost has like 2 kind of rise and fall actions, which is logical, which works okay. And yet you can't shake the feeling it is a bit of just like a data dump or something. It's interesting though that they would clearly continue to explore this idea, like with XI, which has almost like 4 EPs, you know, more or less having like a kind of an identity to them. LSEC obviously is more like explicitly divided. NTS obviously, like each NTS has like a clear identity. So I think you see a little bit of that, like trying to sort of divide this record into, you know, something like a couple pieces where like the mood is somewhat consistent, although they would kind of get better at that or dig in deeper. Of course, the Quadrain GP itself is actually like 4 EPs, and we can talk next time about like if we feel like they actually do have different moods or what. All this to say though, isn't it funny how like we have completely erased oversteps from the the story? Like it like what the hell is oversteps now that we realize that Quaristice starts this journey and they pick it up on XI again and have been on it ever since, more or less. Like what the hell was oversteps? Like a little side step?
yeah, we're overstepping it. I was just thinking that when I was looking through the discography, I don't know, like if they made this record, it like they were sort of forced into the way they made this record with the move and everything, and then I could see like, okay, now that's past, we got a regular studio setup kind of thing. Like, do we go back to working the way we did before, and like that's how we get oversteps, and then maybe in that process realizing like, oh no, it was kind of liked the other thing better, and go back to that on XI. I mean, who knows? It is like a strange thing, and I think like I think personally, like Oversteps is maybe like one of my least favorite records of theirs that I really do like overlook quite a bit. I think.
Yeah, we got to do like a revisited on that, because it's like, we should revisit the stuff that now no longer makes sense to us as far as like their trajectory as well. I had this theory actually. I was like, what if they realized like every 10 years we'll do like a sweet, pretty album? So it's like 2010 was Oversteps, 2020 was Sign. Maybe 2030 we'll get another just pretty synth chord type album.
Maybe. Mark it.
Yeah, mark it. All right, so we do have a lot of tracks to get into, and so I want to start diving into it. First, though, we've got, the thing about this record, like I was saying, it's kind of becoming like a real fan favorite. There were a lot of listener write-ins about this. I mean, like a real enthusiasm about this record, which kind of surprised me. But up front, let's get kind of like some overall thoughts from the listeners on the table. First listener, Tyler, said, these tracks are these bite-sized pictures of worlds that could be. I like that. It's interesting that this is almost the last time they'd have any real amount of restraint with the amount of jams they would choose to release. If anything, later Autechre demonstrates that this restraint can at times be frustrating, because ideas sometimes seem to be cut short on Quaristice before they've really had a chance to fully grow. Honestly, I find myself wondering if AE felt an obligation to cram a wider spread of ideas onto this record. I hate to project the idea that they were scared onto them, but that's almost how I perceive it, that the notion of just running one of these jams for an extended period of time might be perceived poorly, so they perhaps excessively truncated a higher quantity than that they could put out at once. I think that's exactly what you were saying, and it is interesting, because I do feel like there is a little nervousness about like fully jumping in, and then eventually they're like, yeah, who gives a shit, we'll just put out like our big fans will stay with us, like you said. You want to read the next one?
Yeah, EBCD says, I think Quaristice is easily among Autechre's best works, and I'm certain it's within my top 5 releases of theirs, probably even top 3. I don't know exactly when or how it happened, but after years of being perplexed by Quaristice, I started to warm up to it, and pretty quickly it shot up the ranks as an overlooked gem in their discography. While it obviously serves as a foundation for later releases, I feel like Quaristice is a wholly unique record in Autechre's catalog, and I don't think any album of theirs since has really felt quite like it treads over the same territory.
I 100% agree with this. I feel like that is what keeps me returning to Quaristice, is that even though it is the start of what they have kind of been continuing on, for a long time, there is no record of theirs that like feels quite like this one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. It is like this odd, kind of blip proto sort of thing that there really is no other variation of, except for the other 9 EPs around it.
Yeah, right. Listener Joe said, as I mentioned in the Untilted episode, all AE albums up to this point followed more or less the same structural blueprint. 8 to 11 tracks that fit on a single CD, usually followed by an EP of stylistically similar tracks that didn't quite fit. Quaristice completely blew up the formula and ushered in the era of the mega albums, or what critics might call the era of the data dump AE albums. I remember people, including myself, feeling kind of befuddled and uncomfortable with the whole thing. Up until this point, all AE albums have been carefully curated and constructed works of precision. Here, all of a sudden, they sounded like an IDM jam band, with some tracks sounding like they were included as a gag. Even more confusingly, there were sometimes multiple extended versions of tracks. Were we supposed to pick our own favorites?
I like that, I've seen people like mention like some of those tracks, like, oh, is this like a joke? And we've talked about like how there is like a certain level of humor, I think, in Autechre and everything. And I could definitely see like in 2008 that being a bit perplexing, perhaps.
Yeah, I want to talk about that when we get to one of those, because I find it actually weird that, like, well, I don't know. We'll get to it, because like there are some tracks that people definitely describe as like trolls or shit posts or something, and I don't know if I totally get it. So I'm curious to hear what you'll think.
Yeah.
But you want to read the next one by Sunil?
Yeah, let's save it. So Neil says, Quaristice is like a sample pack of bite-sized snacks. Most of the tracks have good ideas but feel incomplete. The flow from track to track is unsmooth, so it feels like listening to bits and pieces of a bunch of tracks on shuffle. It's a fun listen, but some ways unsatisfying.
Listener Rob said, it just doesn't work as a coherent whole for me. Tri-Rep has a vibe. Untilted has a vibe, as does XI. This is all over the place. This is probably why I preferred the quad-range EPs so much. They captured an atmosphere and stayed with it. For me, Quaristice might be for AE fans who don't have the attention span for their regular albums.
Jackson says this thing feels Aphex Twin-esque in that it oscillates between being dark and being totally silly, or sometimes both at the same time. I will say I don't love it as much as I used to, mostly due to tracks like Perlance, Sun de Rimaway, and Sim, which feel like shitposts a little bit. If some of the weaker tracks were replaced with the quad-range exclusive material, I feel like the album could have been more successful as an artistic statement.
Yeah, see, there's a couple of people also touching on this, like, shitposty, trolly, maybe like playful Aphex Twin-esque, kind of quality. But yeah, we'll get into those tracks. I want to dive in, though, to track 1 on Quaristice, Alta Biz, one of the very celebrated ones from this record. AE Pages, I just wanted to note some of their notes, not all of AE Pages' notes, but they noted that the title possibly comes from Audio Ease's Altaverb. Must be a plugin of some kind. Our listeners had this to say about, again, this very beloved track. Tyler said, one of the most beautiful tracks Autechre has ever written. The swelling and falling of the synths makes me think of the sea. It foreshadows Sign. When listening to their discography in order, it's still genuinely shocking to hear a track this gorgeous immediately following 3 challenging, percussion-heavy, often cold, and rarely pretty albums.
So Neil says, one of my all-time favorites is so beautifully serene, and I associate it very strongly with the ocean. I especially love the call and response thing going on at the end.
Listener Joe said, it sounds for a second as if this is the return to the glory days of the early 90s that many listeners had been dreaming of, but actually AE had never quite made a track like this. All of their early era ambient tracks would usually slowly come in element by element and build and then fade out of existence. Here, Alta Biz comes in sounding almost fully developed and following an almost verse-chorus-verse structure.
Sock Mace says, such a vast, lovely place this takes me to. It's like the world around me strips away to reveal only truth.
Listener Rob says, beautiful ambient opener. For me, this could have gone on for a bit longer, but it is symptomatic of the album as a whole.
Jackson says, a very pretty tune. I'd be surprised if any listeners had something negative to say about this one.
And then I'm going to immediately follow that up with EBCD, who says, Alta Biz isn't a huge highlight of the album for me, but I do think it makes the most sense as the opening track, easing us in with its sort of futuristic Autechrean lullaby. I don't have a source to cite here, but I'm pretty sure Sean said in an interview the Quaristice evoked the feeling of being in a dream, and if that analogy is to be held throughout the entire album, I think Alta Biz really works as a gentle introduction to the dreamscape of the album before things really get moving. So what do you think of this one, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously like very just a pretty track, I like how 2 of the listeners both, evoked the ocean. Mm-hmm. I definitely see that, it's a very like heavily synth pad, very like progressive electronic, almost like a, Tangerine Dream or something kind of thing. I think also like EBCD said, if we are going to go with this dream thing, it does sort of like evoke falling asleep, the first moments of sleeping or something like that. Very, very peaceful, really just like very pleasant.
Yeah, it's like gorgeous. It's an absolute knockout, absolute stunner. I feel like Autechre fans were like dying for more of this for, all the way until Sign came out, which arguably gives us more. But this is extra special. I think it sets this thing that I kind of think of as like a defining feature of a lot of this record, which is like the sound of, or the feeling of like breathing. This almost has like an accordion type of a sound, like something filled with air, and yet it's obviously totally synthetic, and it really leans into the synthetic quality. But this like air-filled kind of like, I don't know, pillows of sound. It's, just really, really special, gentle, but also very like buzzy. There are these big buzzy like kind of booms and stuff in there. And then, I just love the way that it kind of gets like more, it just kind of gets sparse and kind of like, I don't know, dissolves in a way. It's funny because I feel like when this track came out, everybody was like, God, I wish there was more of this. And it feels like, okay, we got to get more of it on the, any one of these EPs or what, these extra releases. But, like I said, the truth is it's not like there are longer cuts of anything. Like this only lasted for this little fragment, this moment, and then it just wisped away. And that's how everything is on this record. It's not like it's cut.
Yeah, totally. It doesn't feel, cut. It's a moment in time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes it feel special. And I feel like that's exactly what like Sean was kind of saying, like these little moments. All right, we'll keep it moving because we do have so many tracks to get to. Track 2, the PLC. Interestingly, AE Pages notes that this has vocal samples, on the outro, and they come from Run DMC's Here We Go Live at the Funhouse. I would never have guessed that. To get our listeners on the table up front, Joe says, with the PLC, the rug gets pulled out from under the early 90s worshippers, and it becomes clear for the rest of the album that this is cut from the very same cloth as Untilted. I love the opening 1-2 of Altabiz and the PLC in terms of how it gives just about the full range of the album, which ranges from pretty spacey atmospherics to having a panic attack in a cool, creepy underground club.
Sockmay says, makes me feel like a frog exploring a swamp, but the ground opens up beneath me to swallow me whole, and I fall into a seemingly endless pit of bioluminescent fungi, pillars of spiky gems, and ancient insects dwelling in the rock walls at the bottom of the pit. I land in a trash compactor full of exotic birds and broken technology.
Dan and I had a little disagreement about Sockmace's approach here. Now, Sockmace, I love it personally, but what they did was they wrote in and said, I'm going to take literally the idea of like each track is like a different dream or something, a different door. And here's what I see. Some listeners, I don't know, they approach it like this, like very, visual. Dan is very much not one of these, I like to visualize or whatever,
No.
But I feel like it's kind of an interesting exercise for this album in particular. Since they said that each one is kind of supposed to be some dreamlike door, I thought it was kind of fun to include some of these, visuals.
In that context, I get it more.
As an experiment, we'll see. Maybe
it's
some
nice.
listeners hate
It's
it.
nice.
Maybe others do.
I'm just the Mr. Spock of the situation.
Yeah, no, I know you really don't dig that type of listening. But EBCD said, an instant highlight. I love the assembly of its soft and throbbing sub bass acting as the kick drum, complemented by an outstandingly tinny snare sample and the weird stuttering vocalish sound underneath that sounds to me like some manipulated sample of laughter. The whimpering and dramatic synth leads that come in shortly after are really nice, and I especially like the switch up halfway through as the track gets even more lightweight with pretty much all of the bass dropping out except the fizzing and buzzing kick that comes in and seems to be played almost totally out of sync with the rest of the track. The cherry on top of the whole thing has to be the vocals at the end. I think the decision to feature very clear, barely processed human vocals but chopping them up to be almost totally unintelligible is very funny and gives the track a lot of character.
Rob says, love the bass on this one. I get RDJ and Lord vibes from this track for some reason. This track actually doesn't feel as noticeably short as some of the others. They pack a lot in there.
Listener Tyler said, another favorite. I know it's cliche to compare Autechre to robots, but this track has a real killer robot energy. I know catchy is a very relative term, especially for Autechre, but I think this one is pretty catchy. It gets stuck in my head.
Sunil says, I really like the melodic stuff in the first couple of minutes, but it takes a left turn just when it gets going. I like all the elements of this one, but as a whole, it doesn't feel like a coherent track, emblematic of how I feel about most of the album.
Another example of exactly what I was talking about, which is like, yeah, you're sort of disappointed when it shifts. It does like this one A-B shift about halfway through or so, whereas I forget who put it, it sort of shifts into like almost buzzing and malfunctioning territory. But like I said, like there are no extended cuts. It's just they were moving at like, a minute 2 per idea tops, But what do you think of this one, the PLC?
Yeah, I really like the transition between Alta Buzz and this one. I think that's like, one of the first of those like sort of hard cuts into, a left turn that I mentioned already. So I think, that's a plus for, this being an actually like sequenced record and stuff. I think we're kicking it off right there, showing us everything. But as far as the track itself, like I love just like the skittery, sort of untilted sounding drums, sounding in like they're playing, not so much like we've actually got some reverb on this record and things, which is very welcome. I like in that first section, that little like whoa, 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 like I think it sort of sounds like a vocal thing, kind of sounds like the Charlie Brown teacher or something. It also like reminds me of I couldn't put my finger on what song, but like something in a Kid A song, Radiohead. Like I just can't tell if it's a vocal or not. But then I like how it switches to that little noisy bit about 2.5 minutes in. The drums do that like really funky sort of breakdown where they like kind of go off. I think one of the listeners mentioned it. They like go off a little bit. It leads like into that next section, like such a cool like kind of way that you don't really notice right away. Like I think I even didn't really fully notice it until a few lessons in, and then of course like that in part, the vocal sample, like the listener says, it's really cool how it is like basically unprocessed, so very clearly human, but chopped up in a way that it might as well just be processed, because you can't say to understand anything it's saying. I felt like it kept saying like hiya, like a karate chop kind of thing or something.
Funny. Yeah, speaking of like weird comps, I was randomly listening to David Bowie's Low recently, and the track like What in the World? It has a similar kind of like weird, it almost sounds like a pinball kind of like casino, like whoop, 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 like running over it. Very similar to like the weird bouncy blippy thing that's like happening over the top of this track in the beginning. Actually, that's like an interesting kind of a double feature for this album, because some of like the really dark ambient sections of it are kind of similar to the ambient of this record. But yeah, you mentioned it, but like another I think defining feature of this record and thing that I love about it is the use of reverb, which is always like very synthetic, almost like calling attention to itself. But like they are always doing this trick that they do like masterfully on this track, where like all of a sudden there's like a reverb explosion. Like suddenly this huge cavernous space opens up like inside the track, and and then eventually like kind of shuts up and goes away. But I just love like the way they're playing with that. Yeah, definitely this is one of those tracks that feels like you can tell the DNA is from Untilted, but they're going a totally different direction with it, especially with that like the bone dry quality of Untilted versus the really the dreaminess of this track, which again I think makes for like a nice connection. In a way, it's a left turn from Alta Biz to kind of slam into this really bubbly, bouncy thing, and yet it has that kind of like dreamy quality underneath it still, which kind of carries the thread, I think. And then yeah, like everything you said about the shift into this kind of like stuttering, sputtering beat at the end. I like how there's like this rattling kind of like metal fence type of a sound, and I think that's another really defining feature of this record, is like the creation of sounds that really sound like physical, that sound like they sound like metallic or clanky, which is I think quite a feat on like analog equipment. It's not like they're doing Max here, but yeah, basically starts the record properly with a bang. To move it on to track 3, which is called I.O. A.E. Pages had this to say: as demonstrated by Landon Lechner, I don't know who that is, the main melodic line alternates between two whole tone scale lines, one ascending and one descending. When viewed in piano roll, it forms an X. Interesting. The lyrics, quote unquote, in I.O. are fragments from Stephen Hawking and Leonard, how do you say that name, Dan?
I don't know. That's just like the person who read it.
Oh, I see. I thought you were a big enough fan to know that, but I guess it's not really related. But anyway, A Briefer History of Time is the book, the famous book. When Sean was asked about a connection to A Brief History of Time, he said he had no memory of it being used. So here's our listeners on this. Listener Jackson noted this. Insane Beat Switch loved this one. Apparently the lyrics were taken from A Briefer History of Time by Stephen Hawking.
Tyler says, perhaps I'm only thinking about this because of the BOC bonus episode, but IOC kind of sounds like Telepath from Tomorrow's Harvest through the lens of Autechre's manic beat crunching. I know BOC takes a lot of influence from things like number stations, and IO seems like Autechre's take on the number station idea, even though the vocals here don't seem to be numbers. It seems to me both the PLC and IO are striking for containing vocal samples, something that is rare among AE tracks.
It's funny because this has been coming up a lot lately where we keep saying, wow, it's really rare that this has a vocal sample, but I'm realizing it's not as rare as I actually thought
rare,
it was.
Yeah. No, same. I think so many of them are buried, you know, that it really, like, until you spell them out.
But I want to put together a playlist of like every Autechre track that has like vocal samples, because I feel like it's a lot more than I ever quite realized or appreciated. Listener Joe, in fact, names one of these tracks. Joe says, this obviously reminds me a lot of CSEC. I don't know if it's just a placebo effect, but something about IO sounds much more physical than CSEC does. IO sounds like being stuck in a traffic jam in some terrifying Satoshi Kon anime where people are screaming at each other in robotic voices and then start exploding and the cars come alive and start fighting or something like that.
Sockmate says, zooming down an infinite road at a speed so fast it feels slow. My car yells at me through the dashboard at all the technology malfunction. I'm going faster and the road flips upside down. I see the shape of a city in the distance. I crash right into it.
Always crashing in the same car. Hey.
There you go.
Rob said, I like how experimental this sounds, but I find it a little jarring compared to the first two tracks. It seems to be so much more experimental. I am in two minds if this hurts the flow and vibe of the album.
EBCD says, doesn't make a great impression early on, in my opinion. I could sort of see the appeal in the spastic melody that sounds like it's perpetually tumbling down a flight of stairs, but I think it's just personally not for me. However, the track really picks up in its second half as the drums become more frantic, the garbled vocals in the background become more messy and stuttered, and I quite like the more subtle melody that's featured in this later half.
Yeah, so this one, I mean, another favorite of mine. Like I said, I think like the first 5 tracks of this record are like just hit after hit after hit. But I agree with EBCD that it like ascends in the second half when the kind of, you know, beat, which is all like, I don't know, kind of like garbled and like chaotic, it sort of shifts into like this skittering kind of like drum and bass type of a quality. And the, you know, the sort of keyboard lead over the top becomes almost like these jazzy, like this like jazzy 3-chord kind of thing. It's like quite pretty actually. Really cool ending. But yeah, overall it's like this kind of weird, I don't know, like this like client, like stepladder type of a melody and just like the most insane garbled computerized speech. I don't know. I just feel like it's one of those things that like in just 3 minutes, it makes quite a radical shift. But as a whole really works for me. What do you think about it?
I think this is one of my least favorite tracks on the record. I think that vocal sample, as much as I do love A Brief History of Time, I think it's a little overused in the track and like too up front. And also, I think once you know it's Stephen Hawking, it's kind of obvious. Obviously, like sounds like it and stuff. It kind of annoys me. I think the synth going on, that like stepladder, you know, sort of thing. It's like this happens a couple times on this record, and never really in a bad way. But it's like it's Virgin on Circus music, you know. It's just like it's getting real close to it. So yeah, this is maybe my least favorite, but I don't dislike it. I don't think it's a bad track or anything. It's just it's got a few flaws for me.
Now, I'm hesitant to even ask this because I don't know if it's going to be like a really long answer, but what's the difference between a brief history of time and a briefer history of time?
Yeah. Well, A Brief History of Time is like the book he wrote originally. And that's the one I've always read and stuff. And then if at some point they released like a, sort of abridged, even briefer, version. And I guess that's what like this audiobook clip is from. But it's just a cut down version of Brief History of Time.
I see. Yeah, I don't know. So do you believe them that there's no significance to that at all? Or like, do you get Stephen Hawking-esque vibes from this song or this album?
I think it's like because of like the voice synthesizer he used and stuff, it's just like kind of easy folly for like an electronic vocal sample. I see. And I think that's maybe what my problem is with it, is it's like it's a little bit of a hacky move on Autechre's part, I think, It's like I feel like if you're in, like, I wonder how many people in their bedroom have used like a Stephen Hawking sample, right. It just sort of seems like kind of an obvious choice. I mean, they do mess with it enough, that it's not like clearly, I mean, you can't understand anything that's being said, really. I feel like once I knew, it's Hawking, I feel like you could really feel it in there.
Interesting. All right. Well, we'll move on to track 4. It's called Plyphon. AE Pages noted that this was made by Rob on the MPC, and our listeners had this to say. Listener Rob, I'm always forgetting to clarify. This is listener Rob, said, "I love this one. I can picture this in the NTS sessions. I love how pummeling it sounds, but it isn't punishing over headphones like Untilted is."
EBCD says, an immediate standout. The track has a visceral energy to it with its relentlessly pounding kick drums, only further emphasized by hissing and shrieking white noise, accentuating the percussion and its wildly out of control harmonies and melodies. I also quite like the ending where it breaks into a more restrained hip hop beat.
Listener Joe said, this track is almost perfectly designed as ammo for the anti-Quaristice crowd's arsenal. A quixotic, rhythm-heavy track that never really feels like it ever gets going. I personally love how the beat shifts around, especially toward the end, and I think it links Io with Perlance really well.
Sockmay says, I'm at the club. Everybody dances in slow motion. Their faces are blurry smears. The darkness is thick and breathable. The speakers vibrate the floor so hard I can barely keep on my feet, yet I am vibing.
That could be my memoir. Yet I am vibing. Yeah, so this one, I mean, another banger in my opinion. This one really has like that Untilted DNA. And again, as we've been mentioning, like this emerged from just jamming with their live rig for the Untilted tour. And here, I think you hear that like, that over the top reverb from like Pro Radii, I think it is off Untilted, like that like tumbling downstairs, like kind of pummeling, beat quality with the like just insanely over the top reverb. We mentioned, Untilted doesn't have a lot of reverb, but then there's like this one time where it does, and it's like so insane and exaggerated. And yeah, but it's got, like Joe mentioned, it's got this kind of like start stop quality. Like it like can't get it together. And then over the top of that, I mean, it's got like these kind of loud zaps. This really, I think, like proto M4 Lima esque, I'm thinking of the first track from Sign, where like it really just feels like stuff is flying around your head, like at high speed. And yeah, as the listeners mentioned, I think another cool part of this track is the way it sort of shifts like into more of like a head nodding beat, just briefly. Like you feel like it was on its way to becoming something when it got cut off early. But what do you think about it?
Yeah, I really love like the bass drum on this. It's like at some point it's just like a machine gun, just firing. And I love how like the hi-hat like seems to match it, like at the same beats and stuff. Just like makes like such a frantic, cool sound. I love like what listener Rob said, this whole thing like really does feel like played on the material of Untilted, but like really stripping away the one thing that I dislike the most about that record is that like sterile, environment. So it's nice to like get sort of those similar, things in a much more like headphoneable kind of way. This one too, I should have wrote some timestamps down, but there's like a very small vocal sample that like comes in here and there. It's it's blink and you miss it, but it's there.
Interesting. I don't think I noticed it. All right, we'll move on to track 5, which is Purlance. AE Pages said, for Purlance, the MPC bits were done by Rob, and the machine drum / mono machine bits were done by Sean. AE Pages also noted that the snare sound in Purlance is the TRX clap. Our listeners had this to say. EBCD said, one of the most outstanding oddities of the album with how the track not only acts as a kind of suite of like 3 different tracks, but also generally has a pretty unusual sound with its stumbling and hard to follow rhythm. I especially enjoy the last leg of the track with its much darker, more spacey atmosphere and steadier rhythm.
Tyler says, Purlance does something unnatural with the volume and reverb. I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like the different sounds of the synths have their reverbs out of phase with one another, as if some tones echo and others do not, so the sound seems to be at an indefinite distance from you. Close, far away, moving, stationary, experiencing Doppler effect. It's all as if these are simultaneously true, but it reminds me of the conversation the podcast had about impossible acoustic spaces.
Yeah, that's nicely put. Yeah, like the play with reverb all over this record. I think like Tyler really gets that well. Listener Joe says, one of the anchor tracks of the entire Quaristice project, whatever combination of patches / gear they had going, obviously inspired them heavily, because we end up with an hour, 38 minutes plus of Purlance tracks. Yeah, we'll talk about that next time. I remember Sean said in an NTS interview once that they had a hard time determining what was a patch and what was a track, and I think that this is an early example of exactly that phenomenon.
Rob says, I know that there's much talk about how this album was born out of live jams, but I feel that this track is the first on the album where you can really hear it. You can see how this would lead to the EP versions and why there are so many of them.
Listener Sakme says, I am taking a quiz in front of a vast crowd of silhouettes. It's not an easy quiz, yet the silhouettes scorn me as though it is. Sweat soaks my forehead as I answer the next question. Even the quiz itself seems to grow impatient with me. Its screen expands to the size of a building and towers over me. It turns the sky red and black at the same time. The words lose meaning. The shapes of the world break apart. What do you think of this one, Purlance?
I couldn't have said it better than Sock Mace myself. No, I really like the synth notes that started out there, like so very creepy. I think also like almost in that circusy vein again. Mm-hmm. Like, people complain about this record like not really having like a through line, but I feel like you really a lot of like the same, not the same sounds, but the same palette of sounds are like here throughout it. That's another circus is sort of the palette, but
and it's very like similar to IO, like the way it's like got this kind of like stepladder, like hard step quality to the melody.
Yeah, I think I think this record is more cohesive than perhaps people give it. But also like the ocean, water keeps coming up. People, I think here like the synth notes are very like kind of bubbly. About 2 minutes in, the synth's very watery again. I think it was Tyler that mentioned all the like reverb and delay is like very unnatural and stuff. I think like towards the end on the drums, like sometimes like a drum hit will happen and the delay on it seems to just go on infinitely, or get washed out by the next hit, just like in an impossible sort of way. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's like, I love like the sort of skittering, stuttering beat, and it's like these really fast like splashes of delay, but they like immediately cut off. And I don't know, really really cool track. And yeah, as one of the listeners noted, like I think my favorite thing is the way it makes like a couple shifts like toward the end. Like I almost feel like a couple different tracks, because basically this like really acid riffish kind of thing like wiggles into the middle, like pure acid, and then it kind of like suddenly the beat shifts into something really boom bap, like really hip hop, and then for the end, as it kind of like dissolves or disintegrates, you get all this like these kind of snare rolls that have like all this reverb and delay on them, and it actually sounds very dubby like toward the end. So I kind of like that like rapid cycle through different genres. And I think it was listener Joe wrote into this effect. Can't remember if I actually used it or not, but something about the fact that there are some of these like IDM giants, they come more from like the acid world, whereas others come more from like, let's say, the hip hop world. So like on the acid side, I think of, Aphex Twin, Square Pusher, whereas the more hip hop would be like Autechre, Boards of Canada. I don't know, maybe arguably like Music. I would have to think about that more. But this record is like Autechre's, kind of like their little flex, like we can do acid too, and it's the most acidy that I think they ever get. And yet I think it's kind of funny about the way this track, like it goes into pure acid and then like, as if like kind of in a wink, they kind of shift immediately back to hip hop, I feel, which is kind of funny. But I do like the embrace of acid sound and style on this record. I think that's another thing that makes this kind of unique. Yeah,
totally. Another one of those through lines for sure.
All right, we move into track 6, which is called Sun De Rem Ma or something. Listener Tyler said, kind of haunting. The main melodic line, if you can even call it that, is sputtering and choking and ultimately gets drowned out by these haunting Metal Machine music-esque drones. I say kind of because its sister, Sun De Re-Ix, from one of the later releases, has to be among the most evil Autechre tracks. We should try to make a ranking of most evil tracks. I 100% agree with that. That's another episode we should do. Another clickbait thing, like most evil Autechre tracks.
I like that. EBCD says, a funny inclusion, given that it seems to only act as an interlude in an album that's already made almost entirely out of really short and incidental tracks. But I think it's too short for me to really have any problem with it.
Joe says, a linking track that I love in the context of the album, but I'm not sure I'd ever reach for or even really remember outside of listening to the album all the way through. Something about this reminds me almost of a Pansonic interlude messing around with gear as a palette cleanser between two of the main tracks on the album.
Rob says, this is fine, a bit of a noodler. Not sure what it brings to the album overall. Some acoustic design, which is nice, but again, could do with some more time to be fully explored.
And listener Sakame says, a space where angular concrete pillars weave past one another like tangled fishing line feels like home. Yeah, so this is like a true interlude, which is interesting because, this is one of those albums where it's like hard to say what's an interlude and what isn't. But I think I like this one because it picks up a couple of these threads. One, I think the kind of circusy quality. I think the beginning of this has like kind of a circus organ quality, or maybe even another like accordion type quality, which again makes me think of the kind of like synthetic wind of Alta Biz. And yeah, then it shifts into just like a total feedback whine. I think what I like about this track, actually, the reason I think it needs to be here is because this starts what I see as like that electroacoustic stretch of tracks I was talking about. And I think if you don't have this track, it's like the next track we're going to talk about, Sim, is kind of pretty enough initially that you don't realize like how kind of like ambient experimental it sort of is. But this track here, kind of marking the start of this weirder little stretch we're about to have, it's sort of like ties that next little stretch together. You kind of get what I'm saying? It's another, I think, strong evidence of like a sequencing decision that's kind of setting up this strange detour we're about to take.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's really like a demarcation of like where we are in the record. I like the transition too, even from Perlitz to this. It's again kind of one of those like hard cut sort of things, and then we're in this like what people would call like the sound design tracks. I like it. I think it works great in the same way you do. It sets up this sort of I think we're in the middle of like one of those suites here, and this just like sets it up so nicely. It doesn't overstay its welcome at all. I like the Pansonic comparison that somebody said. I could definitely see that. I got no problem with it.
Well, we move in then to track 7, which is called Sim, or I always want to say Sim, I guess, because it's got 3 M's. Listener Tyler said, a longtime favorite of mine. I don't think it gets nearly enough love. I alluded to this track in my email about Set D, where I referred to it as the sound of a clock whose sprockets, gears, and springs seem to be busting out of place as the track progresses. In Set D, one of the tracks sounds more like a clock self-assembling rather than disassembling. I've always been really sad that this is one of the few Quaristice tracks that never got another version in the Quaristice cinematic universe. That said, this one has such a clear and intentional sounding progression that it perhaps wasn't actually taken as a cut from an extended jam. Maybe it was built, quote, the old way.
Joe says even core haters can't help but admit that this track is a masterpiece. This is one of the few songs on the album that feels like it can really stand alone outside of the context of the record. And it's also one of the ones that feels the least jammy and the most composed, or at least the most meticulously planned out. It also feels the most like the structure of an untilted track with a strong, distinct melody line getting played around with, and then the song untilting halfway through before spinning out into nothingness.
Listener Sunil says, a big album highlight. I love the melody and tone percussion. It starts out really catchy, but then goes through the classic AE deconstruction.
Rob says the tones that remind me of harpsichord strings are being hit are really cool. I think also it feels like a full exploration of the possibilities of the sounds AE is producing. The gorgeous synths after about 3 minutes, 30 seconds are incredible and perhaps would have been lost if they hadn't stuck with it.
Yeah, it is one of the longer tracks on the album, which is interesting. EBCD said the most overt foreshadowing of oversteps that this album has to offer. However, what stood out to me a lot more about the intro recently is the tinny as all hell percussion track. I'm an absolute sucker for weird and scuffed vintage drum machine samples, and Sim might have some of the weirdest and most scuffed in that category. I'm also a big fan of how the track veers in a dark and moody direction in its latter half, with its hypnotic rhythms and droning harmonies, making for a very nice transition into what I think marks the start of an overall darker and moodier stretch of the album.
Sockmay says, I'm in one of those I Spy books. Guitar strings keep breaking all around me. The knickknacks get mad for some reason, start yelling at me. They lock me in a cage where I am shipped off to the place where cell phones are made. I am trapped inside a cell phone. I do not want to be a cell phone, but there is no escape. And then Dan says, that was a weird one. And Gabe says, it's Gaben time. I changed my tune. I'm back on Sockmaze.
Yeah, we've become part of the dream world that this album is composed of. Okay, and finally, listener Jackson says, I think this is my least favorite song in the entire AE discography, to be honest. I get the distinct impression with this one the AE were just not trying that hard, unlike usual. So, interestingly, I mean, Jackson is clearly an outlier here in that this is like a standout for a lot of our listeners. I would not have identified it as a standout personally, but what do you think of it?
Yeah, I'm a little surprised by the standout awarding here. I like it. I think it works well with this sort of electroacoustic thing we're getting into. I think like that percussion, it sounds like so electroacoustic. Like it sounds kind of like a bell or something, but it reminds me of like, in like maybe it's like Stomp or a theme park or something where they'll like, drum on like metal poles or something, like drumming on the, everyday kind of real objects. It like, this really like makes me think of that, which also, the theme parkness of it is a little bit back to that circus, kind of feeling with the record. I really like how at certain times in it, like in the track, it'll kind of back up and play itself backwards. For a little bit. That's like a really cool kind of trick. That droney synth pad that comes at the ends, real nice with a big washed out reverb and everything. I like this track. Little surprised that it's so many people's favorites.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that too, because I think that it has like that through line that I really like in this record, which is that kind of like physical objects, kind of like you were just saying. I mean, I wrote down like it sounds kind of steampunkish, like
that's good.
Like these are like mechanical things, and so I really like that. I love the play, as you were also noting, with reverb on this track, where like all of a sudden this like reverb explosion happens and we get this huge opening of cavernous space underneath. It kind of gets like garbled up, almost like a quality of this, the track takes on kind of like a sound collage quality in which it eventually shifts into like just there's like a lone kind of kick and there's like frog-like sounds or something, but it ends up sounding composed again because like the harpsichord returns maybe in like a new configuration, like a simpler loop or something. And then we do like sort of approaching a conclusion, another like reverb explosion. So it kind of makes for like a, it's sort of tied together. It feels composed. It feels logical. And yeah, I mean, what do you make of the fact that like this is one of the longer tracks? And I think the outro is actually one of the rare moments on the record where it's like, you kind of stay in one spot for like a good 2 minutes or something. It's like the one moment where they're not immediately moving to the next idea. They like kind of live in it for a second. It really stands out because it is so not the norm here.
Yeah, definitely. But I think it sort of like previews maybe like the last track or two where the dronier stuff that I think does kind of stick around a little bit. So again, I think like it's another argument like for this being a pretty well like collated and sequenced record. I think it really is like sort of foreshadowing what we'll get later a little bit.
All right, we move into track 8, which is called Parallel Suns. A.E. Pages noted that Sean has mentioned that this was made by first recording a Nord Lead 1 through Lexicon Reverb, which was then edited down in Digital Performer by having the slabs crossfade into each other to get the final track. Listeners had this to say: Jackson, directly after my least favorite track comes one of my favorite ambient pieces by Autechre. I absolutely love how that squelchy noise fades in and out as if it's approaching in from afar, then receding back into the fog. It evokes the feeling of waves rushing up to my feet and then receding back into the sea over and over. Each one is its own subtle crescendo.
Rob says, I love how this one begins. It's the deep background effects that give it an epicness, puts me in mind of space and sci-fi movies.
Listener Sunil said, evocative and unsettling. This is another big highlight.
And Joe says, whenever I have to pick a single most underrated Autechre track, this is usually one of the 2 or 3 that immediately comes to mind. At first, it sounds like a throwaway extended outro to Sim, but when you listen deeper, you realize that this is one of their most gorgeous and heartbreaking ambient tracks, and how they were able to pull this off with hardware, even though Sean apparently explained it's basically an edited recording of a Nord lead running through reverb, pure magic.
Sockmay said, sailing my little boat on an ocean made of stars, I am alone. There's nowhere for me to go, no destination. I can only look up into the vast dark. The dark sings to me, and for a moment, I do not feel alone.
EBCD says, a nice ambient detour, and I quite like its fizzy, whooshing sweeps of noise throughout the track on top of its deep and bellowing synths. Despite the brevity, it manages to really sell the feeling of observing space and near stagnation as the universe moves at a pace far beyond glacial.
And listener Tyler says, a great example of Autechre's physical modeling capabilities. The main sound in this track evokes the whipping sounds of very long steel cables being shaken. You hear these sounds at different volumes, always a crescendo followed by a decrescendo with different maximum volumes each time, giving you the sense that the wave on the cable travels toward you, then bounces off the anchor near you and travels back away from you. Again, really interestingly put. This is another one that I am like, just surprised at the enthusiasm from our listeners. I guess our listeners, I mean, they love that electroacoustic dark ambient shit. They really love it. To me, it's like this kind of comes and goes. I can't help but wonder. I mean, we've talked before about like, there's a certain type of music, that just, it needs like a large canvas. Mm-hmm. And I feel somewhat like this and the next track, Steels, they fall a little flat for me just because, how much can you really accomplish as far as like creating a soundscape or sound world like this in such a short time? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely understand that. And I think that's a criticism I agree more with on the next one, Steels, rather than here. I think they do a good job of, like making a shorter ambient track here. I mean, it's 3 minutes and 3 seconds, which is a real short ambient track, actually. It definitely, like, I think in later Autechre years, like this definitely would have been stretched out and stuff, but like Quaristice were still like pretty constrained by the technological mediums and, even just like that reticence to jump into it that we've talked about and all. So I sort of, forgive those sins of short ambient, mostly because I think this one's like sounds so cool. It really is just like a great sound design. It's like Tyler had it great with like those like guy wire sort of sounds and everything. Like it just makes like a big, like wet kind of drippy reverb sort of thing. And I just love coming off Untilted, like how much reverb factors into this record.
Yeah, it sounds huge. It sounds massive. I mean, yeah, I'm really compelled by how Tyler described this. And I kind of think of it as like, steel cables like under the ocean or something, because it has that like big like boom, forever reverb kind of quality. I mean, I think it's cool. I don't think it like works on its own because of how short it is. And yet, I want to emphasize like what I said at the beginning, which is like, I really kind of like that together, this sort of stretch of tracks takes us off into this weird like detour before we're then going to like veer back into the bouncy and the bubbly, So I think it's successful together. But let's talk about the next part of this, which is track 9, called Steals. A.E. Pages noted, in the Quaristice tour file dump, I'm not even familiar with, I don't even know what that is. Is that the thing that they use to make that like, that reconstruction of that like Echoplex?
I think so. Yeah. I have it downloaded. I remember like at one point, like a big file of things from the Electron machines was released, and I have it downloaded even though I don't have like the device to play it, but it does have a bunch of like wave files in it that are just kind of noises.
Okay, so in that file dump, the MPC had a bunch of samples of sounds used in Steals, 64 samples of steel diff. So it's like steel diff 01.wave to steel diff 64.wave, and 37 samples of steel XIF, so like 01 all the way to 37. Sean said in a 2008 interview that there were secret techniques involved in making those sounds. How mysterious for such a short little track. Our listeners had this to say: EBCD, one of the strangest tracks on the record. All the weird little noises on display here are quite fun, and I especially like it as a follow-up to Parallel Suns. After the album strays into such mellow and stagnant territory, Steels feels like the album is stirring awake in a haze before things get moving once again.
Joe says, another arrow in the quiver of Q skeptics. I've always wondered if this isn't just a collage of sound effects from some Star Wars video game like Battlefront.
Listener Rob said, love the deep bass tones on this. The background makes it for me. It gives the tune such depth and space. Fantastic production.
Stockmate says, this feels like becoming best friends with an alien, but being slightly unsure whether it actually just wants to eat you.
And listener Sunil said, does anyone else hear hints of Oslo for N in this one? I absolutely do. There is like a coughing, proto-coughing type of a sound. They've been working on that cough for years and years.
That's the secret technique.
Yeah, that must be it, right? But yeah, there's definitely that kind of weird cough sound. Yeah, I mean, it feels like another, like kind of a continuation of this stretch. You've got these big, like subterranean bass thumps, and then like this kind of, I don't know, like a printer, shuffling. Again, it's very mechanical. It's very physical. I also kind of think that sometimes, like at this moment, this is another through line, I think, of this record. Like you start getting into like kind of whooshing white noise territory sometimes. And I feel like Full 3, the track that we're going to talk about soon, which is like kind of built around that like kind of wiping white noise sound, it's like a key to some of these tracks, actually. I feel like you hear that same sound kind of appearing here and there throughout the record. This is one of those spots. There's like kind of that deep subterranean bass. It reminds me a little bit of Plyphon, like, which is really pummeling, but this is obviously much slower. So I feel like there's a tie there. But overall, I don't know. I don't quite know what to make of this one. What do you think of it?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think this one like kind of is one of my least favorites here. I just don't think it like adds enough. It's nice in this little electric acoustic sojourn we're on, but I would never want it on its own. I think that big bass pulse is pretty cool. I was like listening on my stereo, and I thought, I was like, is a damn neighbor like blasting music out of their car, and it was just me. But like sometimes it sounds like sawing happening. Like it feels like the percussion's maybe like built of like very tiny micro samples and stuff. It's hard to really get a grasp on like what is the sounds are.
Yeah, at the same time, I can't shake the feeling that like, what if I'm being trolled? Like I'm just gonna record a track that's like me kind of like coughing into a lot of reverb, and I'm going to say, yeah, there were like 100 samples in that. See if you can figure them out, you know. But now we make a big shift, I think, back into like more familiar, like more awake territory, let's say, with track 10, which is called Tankakern. You got to be careful because there's like a couple of different versions of this that are named like close to the same thing. But AE Pages noted, the equipment on Tankakern includes the Akai MPC, Electron Monomachine and Machine Drum, TR-606, and Nord lead for you gearheads out there. They also note the main samples are of an old oil tank, likely the origin of the title, alongside Birdsong that was recorded in that same garden. Sean also mentioned that the samples for Tankakern were also used for the Skang Mix, Guesscom's Tangle 3, and some other miscellaneous tracks. Very interesting. So our listener Rob said, this might be my tune of the album. It kind of gives me XI vibes due to the atmosphere and propulsive nature. I love the bird song that makes an appearance as well.
Jackson says, quintessential Quaristice to me. The timbre of the percussion is really fascinating for some reason. Also love the overt growling sounds akin to early set B.
Listener Sunil says, it's really cool how it feels rough and smooth at the same time. This makes me think of a muddy stream or river flowing rapidly.
And Sock Mace says, I'm working a million different jobs at the same time. I have no time for life. I only work. I am smoking cigarettes, but I'm unsure how many. The cigarettes butts clutter at my feet. I work so fast my arms seem to triple in number. I am here forever.
Listener Tyler said, Tankakern slaps. It's a track that sounds like a machine with an unrelenting pace, a beeping bass note, and a quiet rolling ringing sound that sounds like a large steel drum rotating. I like that.
Joe says, this starts out as some underground club instrumental hip-hop percussion banger and then morphs into an NTS3 track a la Nine Fly and Ikari. I'll give my thoughts on Tankakern and TKAKANREN next week, but this is one of the few times I feel like the Quaristice version is most clearly a preview version of the longer one, and not just fully developed enough. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, as it still works really well in the context of the album, and it helps give the overall 3-release project the feeling that this really is about exploring processes and not just a bunch of alternate version and outtakes for cash.
And finally, listener EBCD said, feels like a sort of counterpart to Plyphon with its frantic and energetic motion and very metallic sound design overall. I really enjoy the skittering hi-hats and overall continuation of the album's oppressive and gloomy atmosphere at this point, given the track's spacious mixing and lack of melody, with its only semblance of harmony being the droning bell-like tones underneath the entire track. So what do you think of this one, Tankakern? Which I gotta say, I love the effect of like having really drifted deep into like dark ambient electroacoustic territory. The way this one kind of like snaps me to attention. I just love the effect.
Yeah, I agree. I love how it jumps back in, but it still has a little bit of a through line to that electroacoustic in that tank sample, which I think like sounds like a really cool like bell sort of sound. But I think like once you know it's a like a steel drum sort of not a steel drum, but a drum. You know what I mean? Like it's sort of noticeable, but it kind of like ties it all into like sim and everything. Again, not those same sounds, but of the same palette, and I think works really well to like get us back. I think it was you that said like back awake, like back into the other section of the record.
Yeah, it's funny because when I think back to like when this record came out, and I was like kind of a young Autechre fan, and I was sort of excited. I feel like I kept quitting before I got here, you know what I mean? Because it's like I would be into it at first, and then you're kind of entering all these like weird tracks, and I feel like I would often just sort of like bounce off of it. And nowadays I always have this feeling like whenever this track kicks in, I know like, okay, I made it. Like I made it through the hump, and now it's like fun times for the rest of this record. It's just like awesome with this, again, like the pummeling, puttering beat, and yet that kind of like tank sample that creates like this really dreamy like drone that hangs over the whole track. So it has like that kind of, I think it was one of our listeners said, it has kind of like one foot in both world, which is like the dreamy and then the like really kind of clubby or like aggressive. And there was something else. Oh yeah, I think also Joe's comparison to like NTS3 tracks like Nine Fly and Ikari is really apt. The way it kind of like like a lot of tracks on this record, like it kind of opens up a little bit of extra empty space as it goes on, and you can really hear the ringing, like just like kind of the pulsations of that kind of ringing sound. Some of the kind of rhythms there of like kind of the buzzy bass pattern. Really, really great comp there. For me, this is a highlight, and the party keeps going because we move into track 11, Rail. This is the AE Pages just noted that Rail was made by Sean with his laptop using Renoise. And then our listeners had this to say. Listener Rob said, another banger. I really get XI vibes from this tune too. It feels so dark, menacing, and funky. Weirdly though, it feels longer than its rather modest running time.
EBCD says, another standout. To me, it sounds like an incredibly literal take on acid techno, as the bass in this track straight up has an even more gurgly and bubbling sound than what you'd typically hear from any 303 bass line, really vividly evoking the imagery of some facility filled with vats of churning acid. The simple and staggered beat on top of this feels like walking through said facility on some cheap metal bridge that rocks with every movement and feels like it's about to collapse.
While we're, imagining visuals, of course, I got to get to Sock Mace, who says, tagging the walls of an abandoned underground government facility, trudging through the murky floodwater, I use spray paint to tag shapes I don't recognize. The halls shrink in size. My vision goes shaky, dead end.
Tyler says, Rex On is a track people point to as Autechre's most obviously hip-hop inspired track, but I'd argue Raleigh walked so that Rex On could run. Raleigh spends its length in the low registers with an industrial hip-hop beat and reverb-drenched bass synths.
And Joe, on a similar note, said this might be their most straight-up hip-hop track ever, as in you could literally just have someone rap over this and it'd be awesome. So yeah, Rail, or as I heard you call it, Raleigh or
I didn't know. I have no idea.
However the hell it's pronounced. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, this one I definitely see that XI foreshadowing. Like this one seems like it could be from that same era. Obviously, very funky acid kind of groove. I think this is like one of the most like quote unquote normal songs on the record. In electronic music. Again, big, huge reverb. It's got a little bit of a menacing feel to it, but it's a great track.
Yeah, great like head nodding kind of kick snare thing. It's that hip hop, very XI quality. I think like to your point, what makes it actually makes it kind of stand out on this record, but makes it feel like a lot more immediately accessible than a lot of tracks on this record is that it has like a 1-2 kind of chord change. It's like on one chord and then it shifts down and then it shifts back up. And not a lot of tracks have that very simple, like, very basic kind of electronic music thing, which actually I think you hear a lot of in, in XI, as we talked about, where it's like, you'll get kind of like some kind of like percussion, and then eventually it sort of shifts into like the wubby bass will kind of take on like a straightforwardly melodic kind of quality, which I think makes that feel like a lot of bangers, as a lot of people will describe it as. I think this has that same quality. It has the through line of very physically modeled sounding sounds, like something there's like kind of springing, like door stopper type springing like deep in the beat, which I think is really cool, and then weirdly ends on like kind of like a garbled static like radio signal type of a quality, although maybe that was just kind of on my mind because I was listening to Boards of Canada's Tomorrow's Harvest so much at the same time I picked this one back up. But we move into a weird one after maybe the most accessible track, one of the weirdest. It's called Full 3, track 12. AE Pages said Full 3 initially started as a max patch processing, quote, 50 or 60 samples recorded with an AKG 1000 mic before its output was then cut up in Renoise on Sean's laptop. Listener Sunil said the most visceral track on the album, it's kind of funny how they seem to break down and deconstruct something that already sounds so crazy at the beginning.
Sock Mace says, in the underground subway, I took too many edibles earlier. Space-time shifts around me. It feels as though I had a conversation with a god.
Listener Tyler said, a track I respect but cannot love. The panning effects are cool. I don't know how you'd even make something like that sounds like this, but like it's not that fun to listen to either. Is that a hot take?
EBCD says, an amusing look at Autechre trying their hand at noise music. I think this the track goes on longer than it really needs to, and the use of pretty much plain white noise instead of something more distinct makes this one feel kind of plain and uninspired.
Listener Rob said, quite the shift to a noise design track. I wonder if my issue with this album is the abrupt shift in ideas. There isn't a vibe to this album unless the smorgasbord of ideas is the vibe. And then I'll read this one from Joe because I feel like you're not going to get the football reference, Dan. But Joe writes, Tony Romo voice, I don't know about this one, Jim. So there's probably maybe
no
one or
idea
two
what that
listeners
means.
who even know what that means. But what do you think of Full 3?
Yeah, this one. It's funny that we're back in full noise sound design territory after what we just were in. Kind of sounds like stretched out metallic noises, like a car crash maybe in slow motion. I feel like just sometimes you hear like the faintest glimpse of like a real normal sound, or one of the samples. It's obviously it's not one of my favorite on the record. I don't know if it's in the best spot even. I'm not really sure how I feel about where this is and what it is.
Yeah, it does feel like we just got going again. Obviously this is not like dark ambient territory, so I don't think it would fit like in that kind of previous little segment. But I do think, like I was kind of hinting at earlier, I think it like serves an important function. It's got to be somewhere because I feel like it ties a couple things together where you hear these like kind of wiping white noise kind of like things like flickering around a lot of tracks on this album. So it's kind of cool to like have this, it's like the rug that ties the room together, I feel. It is bizarre how long it goes on. I don't know if that was necessary at all. But it reminds me a little bit like that wiping noise. It reminds me of, this Pansonic track I love that we discussed when we talked about their album Colma. I think it's the track Quaristice. It's like one of the earlier tracks, but it's kind of like just play with like sheer white noise wiping. I guess what's kind of fun about that is, Autechre are often kind of working nowadays with sound design in Max MSP, in which they are presumably starting with white noise and then kind of like, molding it into shape. Whereas here, and I know that this is sort of starting with samples and things, but a lot of times what they're starting with is like hardware. And so it's actually the opposite direction where you have to push it awfully far to get it to turn into, sheer noise, I think. So I find that kind of like interesting. But yeah, I mean, this track, it sounds like 50 or 60 samples, like kind of being like flickered through and running in reverse. It reminds me very much, I wonder if you thought of this, but you remember the first track we did a bonus episode on Tim Hecker's Virgins. First track of that record also sounded like all the sounds of the album, like kind of getting like spooled into a tape machine, or something. It kind of has that like we're just cycling through all the different sounds that appear elsewhere on the record, maybe.
Yeah, like when I read the 50, 60 sample things, I just was like, oh yeah, that's pretty much what it sounds like, Yeah. It's not surprising.
All right, so we move into track 13, which is called FWZE. Our listeners had this to say, EBCD, one of the strongest highlights of the album to me, immediately its sense of momentum and energy in its drum sequencing, especially brought out by these sort of whipping and swiping noises throughout, makes this track irresistibly fun and makes me want to just get moving every time it comes on. The way this percussion loop continually gets rearranged and processed and completely mangled with pretty much every repetition keeps things fresh while still maintaining the raw energy of the track. And I also love the addition of the single repeating chord that makes its way in about halfway through.
Rob says, I love the retro digital beats at the start of this track. It's such a stylistic shift to the track before it, and it puts me in mind of In Vain for its old school hip hop vibe.
Joe says, the older I get, the more I feel comfortable with my love for this one. I don't know how to interpret that. This is the kind of IDM goof track that's part and parcel for guys like RDJ and Mike Paradinas, but seemed surprising at the time for people as quote-unquote serious as Autechre.
Sockme says, I steal every trash can I could find and build a mansion out of them. I am very happy about this. There will be zero repercussions for my actions. I'll put a plasma TV in this room.
Okay. So yeah, this one is interesting because, like I said at the top, we got the idea to we always let listeners vote on what bonus episodes we want to do. And it's been sort of fun because the listeners have kind of gravitated toward records that add a little context to whatever we've been talking about recently. So I put up a bunch of 2008 albums. to kind of think about the wider world of electronic music when this record came out. And, you know, two of those records were Flying Lotus's Los Angeles, which won, and we're going to talk about. And the first Crystal Castles album, the self-titled, which I know Dan was making burner accounts to hopefully prevent from winning because he so badly didn't want to talk about that one. I happen to like it. But this track kind of sounds a little Flying Lotus. It also sounds a little Crystal Castles. It's got this kind of like lo-fi hip hop vibe. It's kind of like playful and funny in its like kind of retro quality. You know, the snare is like a pure hiss blast, which again reminds me of like that kind of wiping white noise sound from Full 3, which we just heard. I think in some ways almost this track feels like, you do if you took some of the sounds from Fold 3 and kind of actually turned them into a beat or something. Mm-hmm. But, it's kind of like, yeah, and I also like the way that it sometimes does this kind of like classic hip hop like pause thing where it'll just be like feedback will kind of like swell and then the beat kind of crashes back in. I don't know. It's silly. Does that bother you or do you like it?
It is like verging on silliness. I don't think it's like quite as silly as like sometimes Aphex can get, which I think I've mentioned on the show is like my biggest complaint with him. This one definitely has like that circus energy I talked about. Like I think we're back to the circus here. It's just like very very playful sounding. Very like bubbly. I do like those like whooshing, whippy white noise, sort of sounds like for the snare and everything you talked about. I think it's fine, especially like coming after Full 3. It's nice to have a little bit of a joke, I guess. It's not a joke, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'm going to save the like shitpost conversation until we get to like BNC Castle, which is the one where listeners had something to say. But yeah, this feels like verging in that direction, and yet I also can't help, like I was saying, we'll talk more about this when we talk Flying Lotus, but it's like, it is interesting because it fits in what was going on in electronic music at the time, some of what was going on at the time. And I feel like a lot of the stuff I've realized from doing these bonus episodes is that Autechre is not so disconnected. They're not so tuned out, I think, always from what's going on as I once thought. But we'll move on to track 14, which is called 90101-5L-L. And I find this very interesting. On some promotional copies, apparently, the track was labeled like 90101-51-1, which I guess it feels like it's messing with you. Like you're supposed to think those are ones, but they're actually L's, and maybe that was a misprint. I don't know. It just matters to nobody but like 5 people on Earth, but I find that kind of interesting. So listener EBCD said, another easy standout with its syncopated kick drum and acid bass, as well as the skittering hi-hats and rapid-fire tweeting sounds that join the percussion track. The bass line is surprisingly catchy despite not having any sort of conventional melody. Everything works together so well to create such a great and danceable groove.
Rob says a classic 21st century AE track, beats of effects, trilling tones, squelchy acid synths. It's all there. I love how at about the halfway point, when a lot of the effects drop away and you are left with a deep, almost heartbeat-esque bass, so atmospheric, then the track finishes, and is that the sound of lasers from sci-fi movies of my youth?
Listener Sakme says, in a museum after closing, I am very interested in learning about the habitat of these extinct birds, but the security guards are patrolling nearby. I built a taser using the motherboard from my phone and some gum wrappers. It does not work. I am caught.
So Neil says, this one's a straight banger, excellent groove and sound design.
Joe says, this is proof that these guys should have done the soundtrack for the Tron remake, not fucking Daft Punk. Then again, the movie was so mediocre that the mediocre soundtrack actually went along perfectly with it. Between you and our listeners, I feel like there's so much shit talking about Daft Punk. What's going on?
I think it's deserved. I think it's deserved. Well, Jackson says, interesting, if a little aimless. I much prefer pretty much every variant of it, though. And it's weird to me that they stuck with this one for the main LP because it feels like a jammy outtake, whereas the other versions feel like actual tracks.
Yeah, this is one, as we'll discuss, that has a couple different iterations. Pure acid, absolute acid. This cool, like, squishy riff. Really, the whole track really just sounds like, big kick, big clap. I love it. And I love the, like, really fast, kind of like runs on the hi-hat as well. What do you think of this one?
I think this one sounds like straight out of the Knife's Shaking the Habitual, which comes out a couple years later. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's just like you said, those big squishy, like bouncy, grooves. It like this is like, if this had come out second, I would think it was like Autechre doing a Knife track.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that must be 2013, right?
Yeah, I think so. Back to 2013. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't let our listeners, don't remind them about this because they'll pick.
Well, I wouldn't mind doing that one. I love that record.
They love 2013. Yeah. It's a banger. Yeah. It's another one of these, like, I don't know. I feel like we're, again, like the way that the moods kind of change, like in a somewhat logical kind of sequenced way. We're like really in playful territory here. This is like the playful stretch of the album. And again, it's like, okay, if you find like FWZE a little annoying or something, BNC Castles we're about to talk about, I think like together as a little suite of songs, it's kind of cool like that we take this detour, we enter this door, but we'll move on to track 15, the notorious BNC Castle, or as AE Pages notes, it might be short for Bouncy Castle. I like that. Listener Tyler says, cracks me up every time I hear it. It's fun, it's goofy, it sounds like it was made from sampled sounds of a bunch of kids' toys. Autechre presents Fisher-Price on the Fritz. Is it a little shitposty? Maybe, but I like when Autechre gets shitposty. That's why I'm a proud Marhide fan. Me too. Marhide fans, rise up.
Rob says, I love how this starts pure IDM jamming, picking out sounds, phone dialing, modem internet. I swear it's buried in there. I love how it bounces all around my headphones.
EBCD says, might be the single most hated Autechre track I'm aware of. I absolutely adore it. The jittering and stuttering percussion is a lot of fun and sounds to me like a really screwed up Casio keyboard demo track, or like a corrupted Game Boy Advance cartridge frantically cycling through all of its MIDI samples in rapid succession. I especially love the inclusion of the hysterical whooping sound thrown into the mix. I can imagine why most sane and well-adjusted people wouldn't enjoy this, but I think it's great to hear Rob and Sean going all out with the cheese and goofiness on this one.
Joe says, a thermonuclear assault on the musical sensibilities of the Quaristice haters who have made it this far. I love it.
And Jackson says, I'll defend this one to the death, silly and absurd in a way that pulls off what some of the other tracks failed to. It does that random assortment of sounds thing, but organizes it more musically.
Sockmay says, taking a visit to the robot mailing room. Wow, it's very nice. I think I will seek employment elsewhere. The dancing millipede is cool, though.
Okay. So, what do you think of, I'm calling it Bouncy Castle from here on out.
Yeah, I like Bouncy Castle as a name. This one we've got full circus mode. This one is goofy, playful in a good way, in the same way as like BQ from NTS and stuff. Like I think like Autechre and like weird quote unquote music in general gets like a humorless label tagged on it, often, and things like this show that it's just not true. I think this one sounds like this would be like why isn't this the music that's on Mario Kart? Like yeah. I feel like if you just slowed the tempo down, maybe like 10 BPMs or something, like this could be in a Mario game. It kind of sounds like a boss battle or something. I love this track.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, like I compared earlier the second track, the PLC, to like, the way that it has like a kind of a pinball machine or like a casino type of a sound. And of course, this one kind of picks that back up like in full steam. We should do, I think we've talked about this before actually, but we should do like, just like we were going to do Autechre's most evil tracks, we should do Autechre's funniest tracks. Yeah. I think this is very funny because like in a Marhide kind of way, it does sound like the cheapest possible like ride, sound is like kind of stuttering. The snare is as cheap as possible. Like the claps that are thrown in here and there, I think are like a riot, and I don't know. Yeah, I just feel weird about the way people describe it as shit posting. I kind of don't see it that way because I think that there's like a really purposeful, I mean, if the theme of this record is like dreaming or something. I mean, sometimes dreams get really surreal and silly and weird, and so it makes absolute sense that there's like I said, this little suite of songs, this little door we go into that takes us into like absolute silliness, and I feel like this track needs to be here, you know?
Yeah, especially I totally agree. Like, I mean, like I've said, that through line of like circusiness in it, this fits right at home here. I think it's like, you know, all those little circus things have like led us to this one, you know?
Yeah.
I totally like it. I don't think of it as like trolling, you know, like that would be like, oh, we know this sucks, but I don't think it's
Aphex does that sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Which is my biggest complaint about him is that he's not serious enough. You know, like I do like the seriousness, but you know, sometimes you do gotta, you know, lighten up a little bit. And I think like Autechre does that so well, and this is like maybe the best or one of the best you know, examples of it.
All right, so we move into track 16, hitting the home stretch now, which is called These Were. Listener Joe said, another cool old school hip hop track that almost feels like the low end is on track to Baczynski itself out of existence about 2/3 through before pulling itself together again.
EBCD says a solid and memorable melody, but more than that, this track definitely stands out for its overt use of strings and the garbled sound of running water throughout it. I do think out of all the tracks on this album, this one feels like it ends a bit too soon.
Tyler says, another startling track after the albums that came before. It's melodic, it's simple, it sounds like it would fit in on an early Autechre album.
Rob says, nice, simple melodies on this one. Something also quite retro about it. It could be the way the synths are giving me 90s vibes. It never really kicks into anything. However, it just kind of meanders for 2 minutes and then ends.
Sakame says, had to piss real bad. Finally made it to a gas station. Relief at long last. This is what heaven feels like.
Sunil says, that main melody annoys me, so I can't really enjoy this one.
Well, yeah. I think this is interesting. Yeah, it has like these kind of like, you know, it sounds like sample of running water or something. I mean, I kind of think of it as like a toilet flush, honestly. And it's funny because, you know, Pansonic came up earlier, and I think it's like the third disc of Kesto starts with like a toilet flush. So I was kind of reminded of that track. But yeah, this kind of like, it's a little silly. It's a little circusy maybe. I kind of wrote down like it sounds like sneaky spy music or something. It's like this little bass line is kind of like creeping, and then there's this little lead like harmony over the top of it. But yeah, as one of our listeners noted, the coolest thing about it is like the, you know, kind of strings that like beam through and really take this into like chiastic slide territory a little bit. You know, there were lots of comparisons here to like early Autechre or maybe even Amber territory. I think it's a cool little piece. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about it. I think like the strings, it is like sort of jarring to hear like such just normal string sounding instruments on Autechre. I like those bubbly, watery sounds. This one's sort of fine. I wouldn't put it on the top of my list.
Yeah, well, we move though into track 17, which is called WNSN, which is one of my tops, like one of my favorites, as we'll discuss. But 80 Pages notes that this was made by Sean using his laptop with Renoise. It contains field recordings of Rain buried deep within the mix, apparently. Listener EBCD said, opens with a nice slap to the face with its collage of mangled and garbled noises as if being transmitted through a broken shortwave radio. I like the cold and ghostly atmosphere throughout this track with its chilling synth and light jumpy drums.
Rob says, for me, this track doesn't get going until about 80 seconds in when the bass kicks in, along with the echoey aquatic synths. Elements of this really remind me of Drexcia, and I'm here for it.
That's a good comp. That is a good comp. We should add that to the bonus episode topic list. Sakame said, our pet void beast wants to go on a walk. We cannot let them. They will not survive outside of the void. We must feed them to keep them calm, but they do not want our food. They grow upset. Before we know it, they are the ones ruling us, and we want to go on a walk.
All right. Joe says, I feel like this came out of an incredible jam where they were in an amazing mood, but it never quite developed into something as fully fledged as some of the best stuff on here. The end of the track, though, is incredibly awesome, totally justifies the journey.
And Tyler says, to continue the BOC comparison, WNSN also reminds me of that Scottish duo. The track title evokes a radio station, and it opens with these lo-fi sounds washed in static. Then you get this propulsive beat that seems to have almost all of its bass removed, and twinkling synths that sound almost playful, juxtaposed against long-held notes that are discordant and disconcerting. It sounds like we're listening to a broadcast using old technology. That's an interesting way of putting it. Like I said, this is one of my favorites on the record, which I find a little perplexing personally. But yeah, it starts off with it kind of reminds me of like Confield's Bine, where it's just like a wrapped up, crushed, like physical object or something, like kind of like getting whooshed around. But what I really like about it is the way it kind of picks up. And again, this is seems to be like the spirit of this album, is that like different tracks will pick up like one little thread from previously in the record, and the previous track, That's Were, we just heard the use of kind of straight strings, and I kind of like that this has these kind of like weird, they're kind of like discordant strings kind of like descending over the top of that warp noise, but eventually this very like kind of springy mechanical beat kicks in, and the strings kind of take the shape of a very pretty kind of 3-note pattern. And then, it kind of like shifts into this sort of deep bass note, ends up taking this kind of 2-note thing. So it's all very, it's a lot more musical. It kind of reminds me of Rail, the way that kind of had like a 2-note kind of chord underneath it. Kind of strikingly musical. It took a little bit to get there, but I really like it. And then as it goes on, I like a lot of tracks on this record, it kind of opens up a little bit of extra empty space, and I feel that it gets more menacing and mysterious as it goes on. It's again one of the longer tracks on the record, almost 5 minutes, and this is one of the ones that I think kind of earns it. What do you think of it?
Yeah, like Tyler said, the title made me think of a radio station, so I looked it up. There is a station, WNSN, in South Bend, Indiana. So I wonder if they know that they have an AE track written about them. Yeah, I like this one. I feel like once you know those rain sounds are there and stuff, like you can hear them in the beginning, kind of pretty clearly. Wasn't there something in XI that used some rain sounds too?
Yes. There was, yes.
I remember talking about rain. I couldn't remember if it was that or Tomorrow's Harvest, but I just remember talking about it on the podcast. So it's rain's a nice thing to sample. I like it. This one I think really like skirts the line between like being a sound design track and being like a quote unquote regular track, which in the context of the record I think like works so well. Like really tying those ends all together again.
All right, we move into track 18, arguably the last quote-unquote regular track, which is called Shank 9. I'm like worried I'm saying a slur. Anyway.
Sounds close.
Listener Sakme said, I am giving flowers to the people of many small villages, as many people as possible. I cannot see them. All I see is a piano in the nothingness. I must move fast, deliver to the rest of the people before the piano reaches me. It reaches me anyway. It turns me into a piano key. I was the last key remaining. We are complete.
Jackson says, I just want to shout how awesome the snare sound is on this one. The first half of this track is pure ear candy.
EBCD says, a rare Autechre track not in 4/4 time, instead being in 6/8. The beat feels like it constantly stumbles in repetition, especially later on as it gets even more jumbled and cluttered. I also like the continually evolving melodies throughout this track in both the bass line and lead synth, as well as the more subdued melody that comes in toward the end.
Rob says, I get Untilted meets Analord vibes from this one. I like it a lot with the simple melodies playing over scattershot beats beneath.
Joe says, this almost sounds like it could be an Analord's track. Autechre very rarely do straight acid tracks, but when they do, they totally fucking rock.
Tyler says, manic and claustrophobic at first before it breaks out into a wide open space with a ton of breathing room between held synth tones and pleasant harmonies. This is a trick that Untilted played more than once, and Chinch 9 seems like another example in which the step from Untilted to Quaristice is not as big of a leap as it first appears.
Good, that was good. Chinch 9,
yeah.
that saves it. What do you think of this one?
Yeah. This one, I really like what Tyler said about, like, this one not like the step from Untilted to Quaristice not being quite as big as you think. This one very high energy, excellent snare sound, like one of the listeners said. Just really like another one of the sort of normal electronic tracks. It's like they just got to flex every now and then that they can do, like, just the regular old acid thing. I like the like kind of plucky piano-ish sounding melody. The end, the sample like kind of sounds like a bouncing ball. I don't know if we're back into Drain, Bucephalus bouncing ball, territory or something, but I thought that was notable.
Yeah, it's pure acid, big zaps. It's got that like Untilted-esque, like kind of ping pong ball type beat over it. And yeah, I really like, it's another one. Actually, it's cool because it kind of returns in kind of a cyclical way to, some of the very first tracks on the album. They would do this like A to B shift thing, like the PLC, for example, like kind of a hard shift to kind of like a B part, and they hadn't been doing that for quite a while, but then this goes back to that formula where it kind of makes this like hard shift, and you get these kind of like swelling chords, these kind of plucky sounds, I think, like you were alluding to. And then, this kind of like, I don't know, this like sort of tapping, kind of falling down steps or something, like kind of, these notes that are really quite lovely. And then actually, as it kind of breaks further and further apart, gets emptier and emptier, it's kind of just taps and thuds. And again, that key, white noise, wipe noise from like Full 3. So another one of these cool little like, suites of music. It's a longer track, 5 minutes again. Actually, it's interesting that this final stretch of songs, starting with WNSN, it's like 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and then 7 minutes. So it really changes the, flow of the album, which we'll have to, discuss as we get to these last two tracks. But it's another one. It's still cycling through lots of different ideas. We'll move into track 19 though, Not To, or No To, I guess it's called. Listener Rob said, another handbrake turn on this album, a deep and mysterious ambient track.
Joe says this and Out 9X are such an awesome ambient end to this album and are totally deserved given the epic frenetic journey. I think it's especially effective given how intense Chinch 9 is and how it comes apart at the end.
Listener Tyler says, spooky and another favorite. I have it on my Halloween playlist. It definitely gives an I'm being watched paranoid vibe. The intensity of the track seems to step up in the last half. I think the drones are hypnotic enough that I would have no complaints about an all-end style hour-long version of this.
Sakme says, I am all alone in my apartment. There's an unopened beer bottle in my hand. I will never open it. I am watching as the mold grows on my wall. In the mold, I can see all the secrets of the universe. I see it develop, change, and wither away. This is just for me. Only I am allowed to see this.
EBCD says, another track I don't care so much for in isolation as I'm not too fond of its meandering atmosphere and don't get much out of its buzzy synths or harmonies, but I think it works well in the context of the album as the penultimate track, carrying the darker atmosphere established in Chench 9's last leg and indulging further into an even darker and hazier space.
Sunil says, a good ambient piece seems to be a kindred spirit with Parallel Suns.
Yeah, so to me, this is like the second sort of valley where it's like that weird electroacoustic suite we got earlier is sort of like descending, deeper into the subconscious or something, like deeper into REM sleep, where you don't really dream, let's say. And then I kind of like how the album ends with that same kind of feeling, dark ambient, really kind of underwater chords here. But again, I like how this kind of ties a bow on the record with what I kind of view as like a cousin of Altabiz in the sense that it sounds like breathing. It sounds very like full of air, this track, and it's kind of like breathing in and out. Actually, it was interesting because one of the listeners said that they would like an hour-long all-end version of this, and it reminds me of All End a little bit, except for like maybe chopped up, because it's like the different sort of drifting hanging chords are like, they sound like segments from something longer or something. I find this really cool and compelling. I'm just a little bit not sure how I feel about this track and then the one that follows it, like back to back, but I guess we'll talk about that next. But what do you think about this one on its own?
Yeah, I really like this one. I just love like the big spacey drone-ness of it. It's the like Sid sort of sounds like almost organ-esque, like in it's organ adjacent in some sort of like alien kind of way. It feels like there's a couple different ones of those two. Like I think you said one of them kind of sounds underwater. One sounds like compressed in this very weird way. It's really just like a pretty creepy track. I like Tyler's idea of the Halloween playlist. I went ahead and stuck it in mine as well.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, a couple listeners noted this, but again, like to counter the idea that this is just a data dump, I mean, there's a lot of evidence of sequencing. And, listeners noted that like it kind of follows off Chench9 nicely because Chench9 kind of like, it's sort of like it's emptier and emptier. It kind of like, it kind of falls apart. And then this picks up in that empty space and it ends with like kind of pure drone stillness, which I think leads us quite nicely into the next track, Out 9X, which we can talk about now. Track 20, the last track, we've almost made it, Out 9X. AE Pages said that this uses the NMG2 and Simmons SDE for the gearheads out there. Listener EBCD says, I used to be indifferent at best towards this one, sometimes barely even noticing when it came on with how quiet it is, and for a while thought it was among Autechre's weakest closing tracks. Nowadays, I think it's another highlight of the album and a perfect bookend to this roller coaster of a record. I think it especially makes for an excellent counterpoint to Altabiz, where Altabiz is bright, warm, and colorful as it welcomes you into the album. Out 9X is a cold and haunting finale that feels like the record has reached the bottom of the abyss in its darkest moment. Following the dream analogy mentioned earlier, you would think the closing track could be synonymous with waking up and ending the dream sequence, but Out 9X instead feels to me like sinking deeper into the subconscious and reaching places your dreams have never gone before.
Joe says, totally classic Autechre closer. Quaristice haters who don't get this far don't know what they're missing.
Sakme says, in a power plant, I don't remember how I got here, but I feel as though I belong. The night is empty. Electricity is my one true companion. I live here, grow old here, die here. The electricity remains forever. It does not give thought to my ashy bones. It simply is and will be forever into time, deep into the blackest of pits.
Rob says, I get Saw 2 vibes from the start of this. I do love how it seems to grow in scale and then decline back again to its original ambient atmosphere before building back up again.
Tyler said, good, but as far as minimal drones from this record go, I greatly prefer Not To, so I kind of wish Not To was the closer instead. I'm not sure where else on the album it would go, unfortunately, but I think this one is an album sequencing misstep.
Jackson says Autechre really seem to like ending their projects on ambience, even if the rest of whatever LP they're ending on is largely energetic. They do it for Sign, Plus, NTS, LSEC, and on and on. There are plenty of counterexamples, but nevertheless makes me wonder if AE 2022- will conclude the megatrack with an ambient section.
I hadn't really thought of that, but I would bet everything on it, right? Don't you think that we're going to get like a last set that's going to be just total ambience for like 2 hours or something?
Yeah. That, I mean, I'm here for it.
Yeah. So I find myself, I kind of agree with Tyler in that I like Not To more. And I kind of feel like that would be a great closer. Some people said, I think it was EBCD saying this kind of ties a nice bow from Altabiz, but I feel like Not To also does that. So I find it almost a little bit redundant, even though I do like it on its own. What do you make of it? And what do you make of like the back-to-back, dark ambient drones here?
Yeah, the back-to-back is like the biggest question. I think it is maybe like, because I agree. I like No 2 more. I definitely like In a Vacuum like this. I think it's a very like nice drone, kind of like reminds me of Tangerine Dream again a bit. Like I've been listening to Zeit, and I feel like this could fit pretty nicely on there. But I don't know, back to back, because like it's kind of harkens back to that like electroacoustic section, but then here I don't know, it's kind of shorter, and we're at the end of the record. I like that it doesn't do the like corny thing of like, oh, now the dream's over, something, like one of the listeners says, it doesn't do the obvious thing of like waking up. So I don't know, it's a bit of an odd choice as like this double ambient closer.
Yeah, it reminds me actually of Tomorrow's Harvest by Boards of Canada, the way that ends like on the sort of darkest, bleakest thing possible. Of course, actually the beginning of this track is kind of pretty. I mean, but then it like shifts maybe halfway through or 2/3 through into like just pure dark ambient drone, like very haunting stuff, and kind of just hangs there. Like one of the listeners mentioned, like it's so quiet that you're like you don't realize it's still going sometimes. But the beginning is quite musical. I mean, there's like these feedback kind of whines back and forth. There's a kind of a nice like walking bass line sort of under that, and then actually what I kind of compare to like tabla or something, like these tapping noises that are sort of like melodic in a way that are kind of making this like creeping melody. It's nice. It's got like a slight menace to it, and then really kicks up the menace by like just suddenly shifting into like melodyless just darkness. But I just can't escape the feeling that it doesn't hit as hard because Not To is awesome and does some of those same things, and I kind of prefer it. And yet, it's like, I don't know, maybe fitting for the album to have an album that is like overflowing with ideas to have more than one closing track or something. So now that we've kind of made it through, I wonder what, anything changed by your overall impressions? I guess I'm finding myself like I was kind of leaning toward this, but now that we've talked through it, I'm feeling more and more like this is very intentionally sequenced. Like it actually makes a lot of sense and flows quite nicely,
Yeah, I don't know if I talked myself into it or if it really is, but I feel that same way.
Anything else? I mean, about sort of just your overall impressions? I mean, I think I still feel this is just like really top tier Autechre, and I think more and more people are going to keep coming around to it.
Yeah, I feel like these 2 weeks, and I think I had a similar thought the last time we did this. Like the more time I spend in Quaristice land, the more I understand it and enjoy it.
Yeah, well, we're going to spend even more time because we're going to do the extra stuff. And yeah, kind of like you, although it sounds like you cheated a little bit. I very deliberately avoided. I didn't listen to anything else from I just wanted to like listen to just this record and see how it stands up like just on its own. I think there's something interesting that I'm interested in exploring more next week, which is like whenever I'm in a Quaristice mood, I never reach for the other records. I always go for the main Quaristice. And it's like, why is that? Maybe it's just because they weren't streaming, so it was like a slight pain in the ass. But I don't know. I'm curious. I'm curious if there's something special about the main Quaristice. But to close, we've got some listener emails that are kind of big picture or maybe like slightly outside the scope of the main conversation. So first up from listener Tyler says, it's interesting, I think, that Autechre began their jam era by jamming on tracks from Untilted, their most meticulously sequenced album to date. We've discussed the way in which the improvised style might have been born from a frustration or boredom with the sequence style, but why not start improvising with a clean slate? What was it about the handcrafted tracks that made them so appealing to explode into improvisation? It's a good question. What do you think?
I think it's a little bit of the blank canvas syndrome. It's sort of easier to start with something, than nothing. So I think it if you're using that live rig, it's already got that stuff loaded on it. I think it's sort of like a natural extension.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I didn't put this in the doc, and I hope I'm not confusing it with something else. But I feel like there was a discussion about wanting to like actually record the set for the tour that they had just got off of. I might be thinking of Oversteps, but I feel like Oversteps was actually quite widely recorded. They just have never released any of those soundboards for some reason. But this, they actually did not record anything, and so there was some desire to like record their set. And so I kind of feel like they started, I bet the first jams were literally them just playing the set from the Untilted tour, and then it kind of grew out of that. So I think the answer is probably that they didn't intend to do this. You know what I mean? It just sort of actually grew from the set in a very natural way. In fact, I think that that's part of the reason why XI feels so much more like, like I said, better edited, although I no longer think that it's edited. I think it's actually like a case of like jamming and staying in it longer. It's because I think by the time they were making XI, they were actually imagining this will be a track, like from the start. So they were like, let's stay in it or something like, whereas this is more just like they eventually ended up recording like lots and lots of screwing around, playing around, sometimes really digging deep into something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All right, listener Sunil said, it's interesting that Untilted and Quaristice were made with such opposite approaches, and yet we hear elements from both together in their 2005 Glasgow Art School show. I was also thinking a lot about how Quaristice compares to modern Autechre. It seems like their current approach with 2022 Dash involves putting a lot of effort into composing and then improvising live within the parameters of a very planned composition. I get the impression with Quaristice that their live jam sessions were a lot more exploratory, so I wonder if their general approach to making this album was ever really repeated or if it's a path they abandoned. Yeah, interesting question. I mean, first, I did want to highlight the 2005 bootleg, of course, which is like one of their very best bootlegs. And yeah, it's weird how well it works, like kind of just jumping back and forth between worlds of Untilted and Quaristice. And yeah, as I think we talked about when we did our most recent Revisiting Untilted episode, like it sounds a little bit more like the Untilted tracks are being filtered through the Quaristice approach. You know, it's like the guys that made Quaristice playing or covering Untilted is kind of more what it sounds like, which is really interesting. But I don't know. Like I said at the top of this conversation, I almost feel like they're coming back to this way of working a little bit more, where it's like they are on 2022 Dash, like moving at a much faster clip in a way that, and based on that interview, I think reminds them of kind of what they were doing on Quaristice, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, EBCD said, I haven't seen much discussion in these revisit episodes focusing on the artwork for these releases. That's true. We haven't been paying enough attention. But I think Quaristice is worth addressing because it might have the strangest imagery and packaging of any Autechre release. For a long time, even well after the album became one of my all-time favorites, I firmly believe Quaristice had one of the ugliest album covers I had ever seen. I had to really edit EBCD's email because they went like into huge detail about everything that sucks about this album art. But they get to the point where they say, but I've really warmed up to the cover art and visual aesthetic of the album recently. I guess I could say I, quote, see the vision and how it feels very intentionally like a sort of anti-album cover, one that confronts you with pretty much all function and no form or pretty visuals or anything. The resemblance it bears to something like a blue screen of death or old computer terminal makes it feel something like this image is just what you would see if you downloaded the album off of Napster or LimeWire or something, and you don't get any cover art, just a crude depiction of its contents. And that aesthetic choice actually makes a little more sense in conjunction with Sean's viewpoint of the actual product of the album being the digital download rather than any physical format. Joe wrote in about the same topic saying, the album art is supposedly based on the old Windows disk defragmenter tool. Given that AE has an obsession with formats, and this was the first album in the Quaristice era that's a bit like downloading a ton of material from a massive hard drive, do you think there might be a conceptual connection? Is Quaristice an album of defragments of this from this era? And yeah, just to confirm from AE Pages, they write, Quaristice was the first new artwork commissioned by the Designers Republic since Chiastic Slide. Quaristice and the Quadrage EP also marked the first time Autechre had covers made for individual tracks. Other releases to have individual track art include Oversteps and LSEC. Regarding the visual style, Ian Anderson wrote, the design began inspired by Norton Disk Tool's disk defragmentation graphic, building blocks around the stretched and jittery text pulled in and out of space and time. Ultimately, the boxes became surplus to requirement, and the text became the design itself. The squares have no real meaning other than to suggest no meaning at all, and the color references early consumer technology user guides where the text was prescriptive rather than enabling. The experience is uncomfortable, dense, and claustrophobic. So what do you make of all that as an IT professional and self-proclaimed computer cowboy? And what do you think of the album art of this overall?
Yeah, I've always gotten like the computer, old computer vibes from it, which I think is cool. That blue cover like really seems like, old technical manuals. And, I can see the defrag tool in there and everything. I like the artwork. I think it's pretty, evocative for, an electronic artist, to use like such a computer forward thing, even though this record's not strictly made on the computer like later stuff. But yeah, I like it a lot.
Yeah, I don't know enough to like really like, yeah, I guess I get the overall just like really basic, like old school kind of computing kind of quality of it. I mean, in a way, there's something a little bit like retro and playful about some of this record, which is fitting. But for me, I'm just like in love with the like bright baby blue. It is so
a nice
weird.
Color. Yeah,
it's a nice color, and it is very strange, I think, for Autechre, like, to be this colorful. And I think it's another thing that makes this record feel like unique. It stands out. I also love, it's cool they ended up doing more of this, but it's so cool that there's individual track art for every track. They're really cool to look at, and I love that they've continued doing this. Obviously it's more like the individual, like 2022 dash soundboards or whatever are all getting their own artwork, but I just love how they've continued to like give each track its like own kind of visual variant identity. So I think it's cool that idea started here. But yeah, there's something about the color that just really stands out to me. Well, we did it. We made it through all 20 tracks of Quaristice, and we got a bunch more tracks to go next main episode. But we got anything else? Or are we ready to wrap up with some new music recommendations?
Let's wrap it up. All right, for Rex this week, I've been on vacation, so I really have not been digging into new music very much. But one thing that came out, I think like 2 weeks ago, we got a brand new Ween live record. It's called Bring Out the Foos Live 1996. It's from the last tour they did as a two-piece, just the two of them and then the DAT tapes playing the drums behind them. They're opening for the Foo Fighters. They're playing lots of Pod. Chocolate and Cheese had just come out, so they're playing a bunch of that. Previewing some 12 Country Greats tracks, and the audience is not up for it. They are pissed off most of the time, and Ween, of course, is playing into that. They're being very antagonistic, telling the audience how good of the songs they are playing are and how they're wrong. They play a full 80 minutes set. They threaten to come out and play with the Foo Fighters. It's really a fun time. Unfortunately, though, it's only officially released on CD. This came out 2 weeks ago. It's only on CD. But you know how the internet works. It's easily available. I think it's on YouTube too. But it's great. It needs to get put out as a full regular streaming release and everything.
Wow, I got to check this out. I imagine they thrive in a hostile environment.
Oh yeah. It's really great. I'll put it in our Dropbox for you.
Okay, all right, thanks. Yeah, I was going to shout out. I've been listening to a lot of Kim Gordon's new record. Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth. Her record is called Play Me. She's been on like a real hot streak with her solo work of the last couple years. And it's interesting because her last record, I don't know, I guess she's been kind of like verging in this direction anyway, but it got very hip hop, but it was like very, very noisy, like blown out. And this is kind of cool because it keeps the same like kind of hip hop beats, but like strips it back. So it's like more minimal. And yet, I don't know, it just makes for me, I don't know, I felt like the last record, I loved it, but it just was reminding me too much of like Sleigh Bells or something that I had kind of heard before. This, I think, just sort of stands out a little bit more to me. And it's just kind of like really, I'm jiving with it, and it's like a good, I don't know, it's starting to get warm here. Maybe that's not true everywhere, people who are listening, but I'm in the southern United States. It's starting to get warm, and it's like a good, like, play it outside type of a record.
Nice. Yeah, I didn't listen to that because I didn't really like that last one, so I'll have to check it out. Well, that's it. Next time, we got a bonus episode on Los Angeles by Flying Lotus. Join us by heading on over to patreon.com/GONKCAST. After that, a main episode on Autechre's Quaristice versions, as well as Quaristice Quad Range EP. So share your thoughts on those via Patreon or email at gonkcastpod@gmail.com. If you like the show, help us out. Tell a friend. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Follow us on social media. All that stuff is at GONKCAST Pod, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.